Welcome, guys. We back for part two, and this is the finale, guys. We gonna let her spin. So let's get straight on into it, guys.
I had somewhere to go. The other women at the shelter had nothing. There was so much despair and hopelessness around me. I could feel the hopelessness. Eventually, I returned home to G and to all of the awful things that came with living in his house. Throughout the rest of my pregnancy, the abuse continued. During my fourth month, it became almost physically impossible for me to have sex. It was extremely painful and would also make me nauseous. Still, that was of no concern to G, and on many occasions we had sex even when I didn't want to, and he ignored my tears as I cried through each episode. I can remember him yelling at me after sex because the crying made it difficult for him to reach orgasm. Again, I was being a bad girl. As a result, oral sex became more prevalent in our relationship. My mouth and neck were in constant pain. There was no way I could ever refuse him. It got to the point where just the smell of his skin would make me throw up, and I could not serve him anymore without making him feel unloved and unwanted. G would make me pay over and over again. In my seventh month of pregnancy, G had been called away to New York for work. Not long after his arrival in the city, I was awakened by a call from one of his friends. G had a grand mal seizure in the limo on the way from the airport. It wasn't his first seizure. The problem began many years before I met him. G had told me that he had a pre existing condition that required brain surgery. He also mentioned that on one occasion he had been rushed to the hospital after he had been sniffing cocaine with his friend, singer Bobby Brown. From what I'd been told, G had not been doing any drugs at the time of his seizure in the limo. He told me that the last time he did cocaine was actually just a few weeks after he met me. The cocaine was given to him by the assistant of one of my NFL friends, a linebacker with whom G had also become friends, not knowing of my past sexual relationship with the athlete. Several hours after I received the call about G's seizure, I got on a flight and was in upstate New York to check G out of the hospital. His neck was sore, and he had bitten his tongue, which was swollen and tender. It softened my heart to see him so fragile. It was the first time I'd ever seen him actually need me. I held his hand and helped him out of bed. I helped him get dressed and put on his shoes. We walked out of there together, and anything that had gone wrong in our relationship was no longer a factor. Over the next 2 weeks, G and I stayed with his mother, Hanifa, in the South Ozone Park section of Queens, New York. The house was a disaster. There were roaches everywhere and everything was falling apart. I'd lived in less modern, less desirable places during my life, but I had never seen anyone living in this type of shambles. I was shocked, thinking about how well G and I lived in comparison to his own mother. Still, I loved being there with his mother and the rest of his family. G's mother and I slept in the same bed. She would place her hands on my stomach and feel my son moving. She would cry and talk to him in her sweet, tiny voice. G was away from the house in the recording studio for most of our days there, so his mother and I lay in bed, watching The Young and the Restless, game shows, and talk shows. She was extremely ill and frequently had to use a wheelchair to get around. She needed help getting out of bed and down the stairs. She had many pains in her life, but her son and our unborn baby brought her renewed joy. For the most part, things were going well at this time. G and I had not fought in a while and were getting along, but the peace in our lives was only temporary. One day, while G and I showered together, he said, "I think we need another woman to take your place since you can't fuck properly." I was appalled. The look on his face was almost innocent, as if he saw no wrong in what he had just told his pregnant wife. I blew up and jumped out of the shower. He followed me around the house as I yelled and he yelled back. I couldn't understand. He made it seem as if it was all my fault and that because of me, he had to have another woman. The fight continued downstairs, where his mother sat in her wheelchair. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, in as loud a voice as she could muster. She worked herself out of her chair and began to confront her son. I had worked myself into hyperventilation and severe stomach cramps. Without much warning, I collapsed, and his poor, sick mother tried her best to hold me up when she herself should have been in her wheelchair. G, again, was not concerned about either of us and stormed out of the house. I could never win with him, and no matter how much wrong he had done, his mother would never completely side against her son. How could she? What's more, his mother needed G more than I did. He was the only breadwinner in the family, and everyone depended on him for support. G suffered another seizure once we returned to Arizona. He had stopped taking the Tegretol that had been prescribed by his doctor to help control his seizures. He said that taking the medicine made him feel like less of a man. During the first week of January 1998, his seizures returned. I was 9 months pregnant at the time. G had been in the hallway bathroom, and while he was sitting on the toilet, the seizure hit. I heard him falling off the toilet and shaking against the tub. I jumped out of bed and ran to his side. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and his tongue was hanging out and locked between his teeth. I quickly called 911, grabbed his Tegretol bottle, called his mother, and unlocked the front door. I then ran back to wipe his ass, flush the toilet, and pull up his boxers so he would not be embarrassed when the ambulance arrived. Once they had him on a gurney, I got dressed and grabbed a set of clean clothes for him to wear when he left the hospital to return home. All of this was done in a matter of minutes. No matter the abuse and the trauma I suffered on his watch, I still took care of him. Over the next 2 weeks, I nursed G back to health. He had a cocktail of medicines which had to be administered every 3 hours or so. I made sure he took all of them on time, even in the middle of the night. I would set my alarm clock to wake me up at 11 at night and at 2 and 5 in the morning. I ignored my pregnancy needs at the time to be sure to get him well. I would also rub his neck and shoulders every few hours, for they had been severely injured during his seizure. Soon, G fully recovered, and within days of his recovery, we were back in the hospital to welcome our baby boy. On January 17th, 1998, I went into labor. On that day, I stayed home and counted my contractions. By the next morning, the pain was unbelievable, so we checked into the Thunderbird Samaritan Hospital. G stayed with me every second. He supported me fully and was the charming and loving man I knew him to be from time to time. I was just 19 years old, and for the next 24 hours, I continued to be overwhelmed with pain until finally, 51 hours into my labor, my son was born. After almost 3 full days and the legal limit of 5 epidurals, I was exhausted. She seemed to be excited and jumped around the room taking pictures. I couldn't physically feel the moment that my son was born, but as I pushed, I focused on G's face as he winked at me to check to see if I was all right. I winked back as a signal that everything was just fine. Indeed, the most amazing thing was happening to me. As my son was being delivered from my body, the love I thought I felt for G automatically transferred to the new man in my life. And from that moment at 12:11 on the afternoon of January 19th, 1998, I no longer loved Cool G Rap. Chapter 7: Breaking Away. Over the next year, my interest in being with G had gone from little to none. I had become enamored with my little boy. My days and nights were devoted to him. Being a mother came naturally to me after so much practice with my sisters. I was no longer cooking and cleaning constantly at G's command. After the baby was born, I no longer cared that much about G's needs, wants, and demands. We were, however, a family, and to strangers, we must have looked picture perfect. On our first night home from the hospital, the baby found it hard to get to sleep. He was about 3 days old. As he lay in his bassinet next to our bed, he screamed for almost an hour. When I tried to console my son, G forbid it, saying he would be spoiled. I fought my maternal instinct for a while, but eventually grabbed my son and brought him to bed with me. From that night on, I slept with my back turned to G and with my baby nestled tightly in my arms, against my heart, and the sound of its beating would soothe the baby all night long. It became evident that G had no paternal instinct. He said once he wanted a baby just to see what he could make. Once he saw him, his interest quickly faded. One night, I placed the baby in bed between us for a few moments as I sat up to drink a glass of water I'd left on my nightstand. G rolled over onto the baby and had begun to smother him with his arm. I aggressively pushed G off my son. As time went on, I began to feel as if I had to choose between my son and his father. G had a way of pouting angrily. He sucked his teeth and blinked his eyes excessively. It was a silent intimidation, and one day he even admitted to me that he had become jealous of our son and the attention I showered on him. The baby took all of my time and energy. From the moment he was born, his needs superseded everyone's, especially G's. In general, I knew it was normal for fathers to feel this way, but when it came to G and his pattern of behavior, there was no telling what shape his jealousy would take and how much further it would erode our relationship. On February 8th, 1998, my son was 20 days old. I was holding him while going about my business around the house. I had been expressing milk and making bottles, which would usually take hours out of my day. G asked me to make his lunch, and I tried to reason with him that there just wasn't enough time and that maybe he should make his own food for a change. With that angry pout and look of disgust on his face, he said, "Well, I'm gonna get somebody in here to do all the shit you can't do." "Who? Who are you gonna get?" I shot back angrily. Back and forth we went. He was taunting me about finding a replacement for me since our son was taking up so much of my time. Then, without warning, as I stood holding Naeem, G spat in my face. I surprisingly spat back in his. Over and over, we exchanged spit until finally he placed his huge hands over my entire face, gripping tightly, and pushed me to the ground, then finished me off with a slap to my face. My nose began to bleed. I looked down at my son. He cried while I continued to hold him, and his face was covered with my blood. This would be the first and only time I had G arrested for domestic violence. We lived in a suburb of Phoenix called Glendale, and the police department had become very familiar with our house on Morning Dove Drive. They were called out at least twice a month, and once I was arrested for defacing property when I broke a glass in the kitchen during a fight. G had done this out of spite and malice. I stood alone in the kitchen as he stood in the living room. As soon as the glass was broken, he called the police. The rule was that if the police had been called to a residence twice in one night, someone had to be arrested. G knew this, and on that night, he made the second call. The impact of seeing my newborn son with a blood-covered face let me know the time to go was near. All I needed was money. Although G and I had enjoyed the financial benefits of his music career at the start of our relationship, the money quickly dried up. Hip hop was growing by leaps and bounds, and consequently, the competition was steep. G, like most, constantly strove to find his place as an artist, but that also meant we often did not have enough money to cover our basic living expenses, let alone spend freely. For the next 6 months, I waited for the right time. G continued to have serious money issues, but there was new money on its way since he had recently signed an independent record contract. In the meantime, G and I continued to fight. One night, we were at it as usual. I don't remember exactly when this occurred, but my son had just begun to learn to stand. He had been asleep in his playpen in our bedroom when the argument G and I were having got loud. I could feel myself getting stronger as time went on. When he spit, I would spit back. When he screamed, so would I. I was nearing my breaking point, and on this night, as I saw his hands ball up in preparation to strike me, I leaped at him with the intention to strike first. I knew I could never hurt him physically, but it was the principle. As I lunged, I proved to be too slow as he raised his fist and punched me in the mouth. I fell to the floor face first and automatically checked for all of my teeth. They were all in place, but my lip was split and bleeding. I was wearing one of G's white t-shirts, which I instantly used as a makeshift bandage. I got up from the floor, grabbed the phone, and raced to the hall bathroom, locking myself in. He stood at the door, whimpering and begging for me not to call the police again. He was scared, almost in tears, and I was in shock. It was the first time he had scarred my face, and I cried as I looked at the hideous results. I did not call the police that night. I called his mother in New York. After explaining the incident to her, I opened the door and handed him the phone. I was screaming and crying, "You busted my face!" While he was on the phone, I found myself wandering the street in his bloody t-shirt, screaming at the top of my lungs. It was late, maybe after 11 at night. Before anyone could see me, he ran out, threw me over his shoulder, and placed an ice pack on my lip. A few months later, G packed his bags and was on his way to the East Coast for a promotional tour to support his new independent album, Roots of Evil. About a week or so before he was to leave, I made the decision to have my breasts augmented to reverse the effects of breastfeeding my son. One had significantly changed and was very different from the other. G would tell me they were fine, but I knew it was a lie. By this time, I had lost all the weight I gained during pregnancy. I was 96 pounds before getting pregnant and 140 pounds after giving birth. By the time my son was 6 months old, I was back down to 100 pounds. I was determined to leave G very soon and was slowly preparing myself. I knew that with no formal education or training of any kind, I would have to resort to stripping to take care of my son and me. G showed little interest in supporting his two oldest children, one of whom suffers from cerebral palsy. I knew what he was capable of, or not capable of, but I also knew what I was capable of. I was getting stronger and would be leaving for good. The day G left for the promotional tour was the same day that I had my surgery. He took me to the doctor and picked me up after the procedure. If he hadn't been so preoccupied with his tour at the time, I never would have been able to get away with having the surgery. As soon as we got to the house, G was on his way to the airport. He assigned one of his friends to stay with me and the baby since I was still feeling the effects of the anesthesia. The baby remained in bed with me for the first 2 weeks as I recuperated. Under heavy medication, I managed to make bottles and change diapers. Initially, not having G around was a good thing. It gave me the freedom I needed to heal and grow into the woman I wanted to be without him. During this time, not only did I get my body into order, but I also learned how to drive and acquired a driver's license. I bought new clothes to fit my new body and experimented with makeup and different hairstyles and colors. I also began to experiment with music. One of the rules of G's house was that I was not allowed to listen to the music of other male artists. He would get jealous and assume that I wanted to be with that person. On one occasion, earlier in our relationship, I had become a fan of a song that Boyz II Men performed for the soundtrack of the movie Soul Food. The song was a sweet ode to mothers, and I would listen to it and imagine that my son, not yet conceived, would feel that way about me. However, G saw it another way. He forbid me to listen to that song, insinuating that I would want to have an affair with at least one of the members of Boyz II Men. He was the same way about a lot of other artists, so when he left, I went hip hop crazy. At this time, I discovered DMX, Nas, AZ, and The Firm. It's also when I began to see the genius in Jay-Z, Biggie, and Tupac. I began to feel like Lauryn Hill knew my pain during my separation with G, and like she was a big sister. She made me feel stronger with her words. Her album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, spoke to me and helped build me back up to where I was before I knew G. I listened to hip hop's men talk about bad bitches, and I wanted to be one. They gave me a vision to strive for. Soon, I was ready and waited for G to return so I could finally leave. But G had one more trick up his sleeve. The time flew. Without my realizing it, G had been gone for 3 months. He stopped sending money for food and bills. The baby began to run out of diapers and formula. G had taken everything and moved in, unbeknownst to me, with an ex girlfriend in New York. He stopped taking my calls, and no matter how much I begged for assistance, he would not comply. One night, I had a dream. I called his name in my dream, begging him to come home with me, but he turned his back and walked towards another woman. That's how I knew. I asked him if he was with someone, and he denied it. I asked quietly for him to tell me, and we would work it out. Still, he denied me. I began my own investigation, calling the girlfriend of one of his best friends in New Jersey, and before long, I had my answers. I called G at her house at 1 in the morning. Hi, Ashley, this is Isette. Can I speak to G, please? He got on the phone and I asked him, why didn't you tell me? I asked you and you lied to me. I asked him to please send some money for us and we would talk about everything else when he returned. His response was typical of the man I had known. Fuck you, you stupid bitch. I don't give a fuck. I'm not sending you shit. You'll just have to suffer. On and on he went, and with every word, my strength diminished. Everything was my fault again, and I would be made to pay. Eventually, a friend of G's came over and brought some money for food and expenses. Because of the stress, I continued to lose weight. By the time G made it back, my son was a year old. He had missed his first birthday, his first step, and his first word. Mommy. True to form, G brought gifts when he arrived home from his escapades. Yet, when our son saw his face and heard his voice, Naeem cried. Anytime G entered the room, my son cried. We both knew that our relationship was over. He decided that he would give me the money I needed to leave, $3,500. That would have been enough to get an apartment and a car. I waited for him to give me the money he'd promised, during which time G continued to torture me. He moved his ex, who hated me, into the house. Although there were 2 empty bedrooms upstairs, she and their son slept on the living room floor, and I was trapped upstairs unless I wanted some sort of confrontation. She and G had never gotten along until right then, which was just for his convenience and spitefulness. All of a sudden, they were the best of friends, hanging out all day, laughing and carrying on. I was an outsider in my own home and had to sneak around to avoid confrontations with either or both of them. G was not beating me physically at this time, but inside I was bruised and battered. He also never missed a moment to tell me how ugly and skinny I was, how he was disgusted just looking at me. G spent hours upon hours on the phone with his girlfriend in New York, Ashley. The phone and other bills of the household were in my name, and all I wanted to do was to cut everything off, but I knew I would only be asking for more problems if I did. My strategy was to get through and get out. I waited 3 long weeks for the $3,500. In the end, all he gave me was 1,000. Toward the end of the 3 week period, I began to realize that he was never going to give me what I needed in order to leave. He needed me to need him, even if he wanted nothing to do with me. He enjoyed seeing my bony frame and lifeless eyes because he knew that not only was he the reason for my state, he also controlled it. Just as he had explained why he wanted a child, just to see what he could create. So now he wanted to see what he could destroy. I began to pack. Many of my belongings I would leave behind, but I packed most of the baby's things. Anything big or heavy would have to be left behind. I had $800 left after buying luggage and basic necessities. I hid my bags and made no reference to my leaving. G had gotten me an apartment in the same neighborhood we lived in, which was about an hour away from the city. I had no car and no resources. I would not be staying there. I hit the wall the day G was on the phone in our loft with Ashley for more than 6 hours and finally went to bed around 2 in the morning. I had already called a friend of mine who worked for an airline on G's cell phone, being sure to erase the number after I hung up. I lay in bed with my son, pretending to be asleep. I waited for the sound of the phone hanging up. Finally, he threw himself into bed and within minutes began to snore. I slid out of bed, called my friend from the loft phone, and placed my bags at the door. I snuggled my 1-year-old son in his winter coat as he slept. Without a hitch, my son and I quietly walked out and closed the door on a painful chapter. It was January 1999, and I was finally leaving Coogee Rap for good. Chapter 8: Fire and Ice. As I drove away from the home G and I shared for the past 3 years, my heart seemed to sink into my stomach. I refused to look back, afraid I would lose my nerve. That night, my son and I slept over at a friend's house, and early the next morning, he put us on an airplane to Los Angeles. G's former manager, Chuck, had made arrangements for us to stay a week at his apartment in Studio City, a suburb of Los Angeles, while he vacationed in Hawaii. Chuck had recently moved to LA and was now the head of artist and repertoire for Dr. Dre's Aftermath Records. Chuck and I had stayed in touch unbeknownst to G, and he had been fully aware of the relationship troubles from the very beginning. He had even stayed with G and me at our home for the first few months of our relationship. I was relieved to have somewhere else to go, even if only for a little while. Chuck was waiting at baggage claim when Naeem and I arrived at Burbank Airport. I tried to make eye contact with him, yet he kept sweeping over me with his eyes. Finally, I called his name, and as his eyes settled upon me, they became frozen in disbelief. He had not recognized me for my extremely thin, 95-pound frame. My eyes were sunken in with dark circles around them, and my ribcage clearly showed through my clothes. I dove into his arms and began to cry with relief. Chuck soon got us settled in his apartment, making sure that we had food to eat and that I was acquainted with the property, pool, laundry room, and whatnot. The purpose for this week-long trip to Los Angeles was for me to collect my thoughts and get myself together. I had a lot to think about. There were custody and child support issues to figure out. I also needed to have a plan for my immediate future. I needed to find a way to buy a car and to go to school so I can get a job to support myself and my son. I used that week in Los Angeles to recuperate in order to go back to Phoenix stronger. On one of my last nights in Los Angeles, Chuck saw to it that one of his friends took me out for a night on the town. I was feeling extremely awkward, but still very excited to be going out. This was the first time that I would be introduced to the infamous Sunset Strip and the House of Blues. I remember walking around and the response of the men who walked past me. They would grab my arms and hands and ask me to dance. I was flattered, but still unsure of myself, so I would decline. The night was coming to a close, and I began to search for Chuck's friends. During my search, I was stopped by yet another man who quickly introduced himself as Marquise from the notorious Two Live crew. We had a brief exchange, and he wrote his phone number on a napkin as I promised to call him the next day. As I walked away, my eyes wandered about and soon became fixated on a man surrounded by women. He stood in the shadows, and all I could make out was his fedora and the ringlets of hair which dangled from under it. He also carried a walking stick, and from what I could tell, was very well dressed in a well tailored blue suit. There were women clamoring around him, some who obviously knew him, and many who wanted to. As he turned around, his ringlets bounced, and his first step was a confident one. That's when I realized I was staring at rapper, actor, Ice-T. Just then, I was tapped on the shoulder from behind by the guys I'd come with and was told it was time to leave. With one last look at Ice-T, I reluctantly followed behind the guys. There was something about Ice that kept me thinking about him for the rest of the night. He exuded confidence and power, and even without speaking to him, I could tell he had it all together, and that being surrounded by all those women didn't excite him nearly as much as it excited them. He was used to it, and any one of those women would be better serviced by being with him, whereas he was already made and needed no woman to make him. I returned to Chuck's apartment that night, confident that I wanted to live in the city of lost angels. The next evening, I put a call into Marquise, and we talked for about an hour. Once he began to ask me about myself, I went on about all the things I had been through with G and how I had no idea what was to come back in Phoenix. All of a sudden, with a sense of urgency in his voice, he said, "There's someone you should meet. I think he could help you. Let me see if I can find him and call you back." I waited nervously by the phone for about 20 minutes before it rang again. Marquis said hello and then checked to see if his friend was on the line. "Ice, you there?" Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, I'm here." Marquise continued, "Isette, this is Ice-T. He's a good friend of mine, and I told him about you and your son and what you guys are going through right now. He can help you. Go ahead, Ice." Ice spoke to me for a few minutes and gave me his number. He said he didn't want to say much over the phone and that we should meet the following day. The next day, Chuck had returned from Hawaii to meet the moving trucks that would be taking him to a new house he had just purchased, and I was going to a hotel close to the airport since I would be leaving the following morning. Once I checked into the hotel, I immediately called Ice and asked him to meet me there. Within an hour, he was at the door. I opened the door and let him in. It was sort of uncomfortable meeting him for the first time. I was nervous and hopeful that he would say or do something that would change the course of my life. He sat on the end of the bed as I sat at the adjacent desk, telling him my story from start to finish as my son crawled around, playing on the floor. The look in his eyes softened more and more as I related the events of my life and relationship with G. I told him I was on my way back to Phoenix to tie up some loose ends and try to get an apartment and a job, but I decided to eventually move to Los Angeles. He told me his heart went out to me and my son, and that he had been very affected by my story when Marquise had first told it to him, but was especially moved now as he sat there watching my son and me together. He gave me some money, about $300, and said that if I needed anything while in Phoenix, to be sure he was the first person I called. He also assured me that when I was ready to move to Los Angeles, he would see to it that I was taken care of until I was settled. I'd found a true friend and went back to Phoenix with a sense of security and a new strength. I had a way out, and it was available to me whenever I was ready to take it. Over the next 10 months, I stayed in Phoenix. I was determined to put my failed marriage and everything that had occurred before it behind me. Since G and I had been separated, I had moved into my own apartment and worked several odd jobs trying to make ends meet, including a stint as a car salesperson. I settled on taking a quick nurse's aid course and got placed in a nursing assistant position at a senior care hospital. Then finally, I worked as an apartment leasing consultant. G, in the meantime, was in and out of town, living between New York and Arizona as he worked to revitalize his career. He'd somewhat downgraded his lifestyle and no longer lived in the house we shared. Instead, he rented a 3-bedroom apartment in a Phoenix suburb and lived with his girlfriend, Ashley, who'd moved from New York. He also began to spend large amounts of money on diamond and platinum jewelry while I continued to struggle with our son. G and I ended up living about 4 blocks apart, so he'd stop by my apartment to see me and the baby. Never once did I think of going back. I did, however, think we could at least work together to do the right thing for our son. I was wrong. Eventually, I saved enough money to buy my first car, a Nissan Sentra. I was so excited that I called G to tell him. His first words to me were, "Why would you buy a car? Take it back and I'll buy you one later." The summers in Phoenix were scorching, with temperatures upward of 120 degrees. Until I bought the car, I had been walking with my son to and from the grocery store while dodging 4 lanes of traffic. I had been wasting money on cabs or waiting for G to give me a ride whenever he was in town. In response to his telling me to take the car back, I simply told him I would and hung up the phone, knowing that G still didn't want the best for me or my son. I knew him well enough to know that he had no intention of buying me a car. He just wanted me to take the car back because he couldn't stand for me to be independent. Well, too late. I knew this car was the best thing for me, and I would no longer allow him to dictate my life. I called ICE to tell him about the car, and he was happy for me. He was my support system, the only person in my life who was building me up, whereas everyone else seemed to be tearing me down. I began to no longer look for G's approval and counted on only ICE to be my guide. We would talk on the phone at least once a week. He sent money when I needed it and gave me advice, like only he could. He told me there was no way I would make it in Phoenix and I needed to get to Los Angeles right away. He felt it was futile for him to continue sending me money in a place where I could never get ahead. Ice continually reassured me that I was meant to be something greater than I was. I was living in a 1 bedroom apartment with no furniture, and the money I made with my job barely paid the accumulating bills and childcare expenses, not to mention the enormous amount of debt I took on once G left me with all the bills from the house. I was ready to go, and Ice was behind me all the way. It wasn't long before I filed papers at the local courthouse for regulated child support and shared custody, but it would prove to be a slow moving process. G pitched in financially once in a while, but it never seemed to be enough. I was in school and working part time while G was living the high life, being the rap star he always wanted to be. I wanted a chance to start over, too, in another city. It was my turn to get my life together. I was also angry because I had been doing all of the parenting by myself, and while G was getting his life in order, I felt confined by our child. I just needed a break, a chance to grow and learn and be someone different, someone other than this needy woman I had become. I wanted to be who I was before I met him, the confident, fearless, single me. There was just one thing I had to do before leaving Arizona: temporarily leave my son behind. Just in case I was making the wrong move. Just in case I failed. I didn't want Naeem to fail with me. I wanted to be stable before bringing my son along, and although G and I had our problems, I knew he would never harm his son. While I'm not proud of the way I went about it, what I did next set me on the road to Los Angeles without my son. I drove the few blocks to G's apartment and arrived there just in time to see him getting into his car with a friend who was visiting from out of town. Impulsively, I sped up to the rear of G's car, and with a swift turn of the steering wheel, I blocked him in. My heart was pounding, and all the sounds around me became muted. I flung open my car door, jumped out, and opened the back passenger door. I took my 1-year-old son from his seat, grabbed his bag, and placed them both in the parking lot in front of G and his friend. And just as fast as I sped in, I hurried out before he could protest, and didn't stop until I hit the Hollywood city limits. Each of those 6 hours felt like 100 as I drove to Los Angeles. Ice had given me directions and reserved a suite for me at a hotel. I called him every hour to let him know the trip was going well. Along the way, I fantasized about what my new life would be like. I imagined the clothes and the cars. My mind traveled back to the women in the videos who I admired, and I imagined myself looking just like them. I was happy, but more importantly, I was focused. The journey ended at Franklin and Orchid Avenues in the heart of Hollywood. The street was dark and narrow, with a row of tiny hotels and tenements on each side. I took a deep breath before I entered the building. I was in shock. I pulled it off. I actually left it all behind: my old man, my old house, my old life, my new baby, my new baby. I picked up the room key at the front desk. Once I was settled, there was a soft knock at the door, and my heart seemed to skip 1,000 beats. I straightened my clothes, smoothed out my hair, took another deep breath, and flung the door as wide as it would go until it hit the adjacent wall. I jumped into Ice T's arms and held on as tight as I could. I smelled him, taking in every molecule. Ice and I spent most every day together. I craved to be near him. I needed him. I needed Ice to teach me, to make me better, and to undo all of the awful things that had been done to me. Ice taught me a lot about how to make it in Los Angeles: where to eat, where to shop, how to negotiate, and how to know my worth professionally. He also taught me about the Hollywood nightlife, and we'd frequent some of the hottest clubs in the city. Yet he wasn't about dancing and partying. He observed. It was typical for us to grab a spot in the far right corner, always in position so Ice could see everyone who came and went and what they were doing. He usually wore a hat of some sort, sat with his legs crossed, appearing as if he was deep in thought. He rarely moved until it was time to go. On the nights when we stayed in, and there were many, Ice and I would quietly lie together, enjoying each other's presence. Sometimes we drove around in his black on black S600 Mercedes, and I held his hand. Ice taught me that I should never hold someone's hand completely, just the smallest finger. This would show that I'm not asking for all of him, just a small part. And from that day forward, I would hold his pinky finger and love that small part of him. We spent a lot of time at his office in Hollywood, where he had a pimp room. The office was on the top floor of the building and it overlooked the city. The pimp room had oversized red velvet curtains and black leather sofas. There were a few accessories that stood out: a giant pimptionary, a dictionary of pimp terminology, and a video camera set upon a tripod. In this room, we watched porn and made a few flicks of our own. When we were together, I felt like a woman. I was all his. I remember that first Christmas in Los Angeles. It fell on a Sunday, and he told his then longtime girlfriend and their young son that he was going to the bank or something. He came over and spent time with me so I wouldn't be alone. We both knew there was really no excuse for him not to be at home on Christmas morning since everything was closed, but that never mattered to us. He operated in his own space and time. No one made Ice do anything he didn't want to do. When we made love, it was never sexual. Rather, it was like he was feeding me. With every slow, wet stroke, with every warm, sweet kiss, he gave me pieces of himself and let me know that he trusted and cared for me. I felt grown up, knowing I could please a man like that, a man with so many more years and experiences than me. At those moments, I felt complete. Chapter 9: Pain is Love. Once I had been in Hollywood for a few weeks and had regained a certain amount of confidence, I was ready to try out my new life. It was January 2000, and I was 21 years old. I still felt unworthy of any kind of praise or acceptance, but all I needed was the right outfit and enough makeup to mask these insecurities. One afternoon, I turned away from MTV for a moment to gather another pile of outdated clothes, and just then, something drew me back to the TV screen. It was a new voice. It was raspy and commanding, and the words were sharp and titillating. The singer's skin was dark and his body was cut. He seemed short, but still very big in presence. I waited intensely for the end of the song so I could read the credits and commit his name to memory. It read, Ja Rule, and I whispered his name as if to place it onto my lips for tasting, and followed that with, I want that one. I drove to the Garden of Eden, a popular nightclub just 3 blocks from my hotel, and one which Ice and I had gone to pretty frequently. I went alone that night, as would become typical for me. The club was very crowded, so I settled in at the bar. I felt I had better start drinking and fast because I was so nervous. Although I'd worked as a dancer in strip clubs, this was different. I had never been to a club before just to socialize, and I wasn't sure what to do. I was certain that the liquor would tell me. I mingled a bit, and before long, I grew increasingly bored. I was new to the club scene in this respect and hadn't found the purpose of it all. There was a whole upstairs portion to the club that I hadn't discovered, where they housed the VIP section. After a few bats of the eyelashes and a smile or two, I was let up. It took about 2 minutes after I entered the VIP section before it happened. I saw him, and I had to blink twice. I was looking at him, and I couldn't believe he was looking at me. As I stared, he flooded his bloodshot eyes with eye drops. Then he made his way toward me, and I swallowed so hard it felt like I popped an eardrum. I didn't hear or see anything else around me. His mouth opened, and in some sort of cinematic slow motion, he began to speak to me. I thought for sure I wouldn't be able to hear him since everything else seemed to have faded to a white noise, but his voice was clear. Oh God, help me, I thought. Ja Rule, the man I'd seen in the video for the first time earlier that night in my hotel room, was talking to me. He was beautiful. The way those first few words sashayed beyond his lips and slammed into mine, the confidence he embodied. He was just as I thought he would be, the way he was on television. It was like he heard my words and followed me here just to make my wish of wanting to meet him come true. We quickly got the formalities out of the way. Hi, how are you? He asked. Where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. To tell the truth, all I wanted at that exact moment was for him to touch me, to take me with him. I felt inadequate, but I put on a confident front. God, I hope he doesn't see through this lie, I thought to myself. And just as I felt him moving closer to me, he abruptly turned and looked behind him. Then he backed away, looking at me and shrugging his shoulders as if to say, sorry. I knew she wasn't his girlfriend or wife. I could tell from her posture that she was just as insecure at the moment as me. As soon as I came to that conclusion, I became more determined than ever, as if her self-doubt fueled my assurance. Let the games begin, I thought. Just as this ran through my head, the lights came on, and it was time to go. I would not let him get away from me. He may be going home with her tonight, but starting tomorrow, he will be mine. I scrambled around looking for a piece of paper, a napkin, anything to write on, and I pulled a nearly inkless pen from my purse. Just as he got a few paces past me, I trotted behind him, grabbed his left hand, as she held his right, and pressed my name and number into his fist. He looked at me and smiled as I brushed past and walked ahead of them through the doors. He was mine. Ja Rule and I would talk over the next 4 months, but were never able to see each other because he was busy with his career, and I was busy still settling into my new life in LA. Meanwhile, I decided to fly to New York on January 17th, 2000, to pick up my son just days before his second birthday. G had taken him there, and although we had only been apart for 1 month, I just couldn't go on without my son any longer. Having my son in Los Angeles would make my transition harder, but not having him made everything else impossible. I went straight from the airport to G's family's house in Queens. As is typical for a New York City winter night, it was bone chilling cold, around 17 degrees. An old friend of mine had picked me up at the airport and waited outside in the car as I got my son. This was not the same house in which I'd stayed with G and his mother prior to my son being born. This was the house where G's mother had died. Her spirit was still there. I could feel her. However, G was nowhere to be found, as usual. He dropped Naeem off the moment he arrived in New York from Phoenix with a cousin. When I arrived, I was distraught to find that my son, at just 2 years old, was drinking sugary grape Kool-Aid and had a newly acquired rotten front tooth. G's whole family had bad teeth, and now I could see why. G's teeth would fall out and chip every time he ate, and his brother at 40 had no teeth at all. This was definitely nowhere for my son to be, and regardless of the hardships ahead, I knew Naeem would be better off with me. I hastily grabbed him and his suitcase and jetted out the house, using my waiting friend as an excuse for my rush. Happy to be with my son again, we flew back to Los Angeles, and I was ready for whatever awaited us. Having my son with me in Los Angeles allowed me to feel more complete, but unfortunately, it didn't stop me from continuing to enjoy the nightlife. I hired a sitter and began going out as much as I possibly could. The next few months went by pretty fast. Although Ja Rule and I continued to grow close with our frequent phone conversations, I found myself juggling a few new people in my life as well. While I waited for Ja to head back to Los Angeles, I became friendly with Fred Durst, the lead singer of Limp Bizkit. We met on a clear winter day. The sun was bright, and although the breezes were chilly, the overall temperature was unseasonably warm. I was pulling into the underground parking garage of Interscope Records in Westwood. As I pulled in, he was pulling out. Our eyes met, and I recognized his face but couldn't place it. After hesitating a bit, I kept going. All of a sudden, his SUV stopped. He blared his horn and reversed his car with force. We casually introduced ourselves as he blurted, "Don't you know who I am?" I responded, no. Should I? I already loved his cockiness. "I'm Fred Durst from Limp Bizkit. I'm the senior vice president of this company. Who are you going up there to see?" I was caught for a moment in the sea that was his eyes. Crystal blue, piercing through me and making me want him. I could smell the power oozing from his pores, and I was so turned on, I knew I'd need a shower after this encounter. "I'm going to see my boy Big Chuck," I sputtered, as he cut me off to tell me that he knew Chuck really well and that he thought I was beautiful. As he hopped down from his SUV, his physical appearance delighted me. This big man was actually kind of small. He had this swagger about him that commanded attention. We exchanged numbers, and I listened intently to every word he said as I watched his lips beckon to me. He said he would be back at the office in a few hours, and he would call me then. I remained outwardly calm, but inside I was overwhelmed. I was mesmerized and flattered. Once he sped off, I was alone with my drifting thoughts. Breathing once again, I actually jumped around a bit, which is embarrassing to admit. I regained my composure and headed up to see Chuck. My time at the Interscope offices was brief, but I hesitated to leave. Like a girl with a high school crush, I thought, what if Fred calls and I can't get to him in time? What if I never see him again? So, as the parking garage emptied, I stayed and waited for Fred to call me. Finally, we spoke, but I was too ashamed to mention that I was still outside the garage where we had met 3 hours prior. I went back to my hotel room, exhausted from hoping and pretending, but I was also determined he would not get away from me. By April 2000, Ja Rule and I had spoken so much over the phone since the first night we met that I had grown to know him pretty well. He was coming back to Los Angeles after spending a few weeks on the East Coast. I couldn't wait. L'Hermitage, an uber luxury hotel on Burton Way in the heart of Beverly Hills. Room 416. When I think back on this night, it's funny to recall how, in the midst of such grandeur, I was so casually attired. I was in my then typical casual wear of jeans and a t shirt, with my hair pulled back in a modest ponytail. Yet, I was seduced by the luxury and posh detail that surrounded me at L'Hermitage. I arrived at the room and knocked lightly on the door before I realized that it was already ajar. I slowly opened it farther and stuck my head in. Hello? The lights were dim, and the radio was tuned to 92.3. The songs were slow favorites, and I began to hum along as I walked in, feeling comfortable. I put down the overnight bag I had packed in anticipation. I looked around a bit, but was really afraid to move too much for fear of disturbing the ambiance. I sucked it all in. I could taste it. Just then, he walked in. He was short and dark, just like the drink he held, lazily swirling it around in a glass as he stood there staring at me. All he wore was a white hotel bathrobe and bed slippers. I just wanted to run to him and tear him apart. I wanted to suck his mouth and taste the liquor, to lick his neck and chest. I wanted the salt of his sweat to help me chase the heat of his kiss. Before I finished that thought, I had him there in my mouth, and in those moments, I was a beast. He squirmed and twisted his body in ways that almost frightened me. It seemed as if he would snap in two or even spontaneously combust from the pressure of screaming into a down-filled pillow. I had him. I knew it. What I was doing to his body was new to him and especially new to me. As I sucked and licked, he screamed and suddenly grabbed both of his ankles as he threw them into the air. I was powerful at this moment. I discovered something new. I had the power here. Glass vases filled with marbles crashed all around us as he began tossing linens from the bed. As the marbles scattered, we laughed in unison. We were just beginning. The rest of the night, we explored countless positions. I remember the exact moment that I first lay on my back for him. I looked up at him as he knelt before me. My legs were wrapped around his waist, and just before his body was to merge with mine, I noticed his upper right chest. On it was a tattoo with the words, "Pain is love." I ran my fingers over the prophetic words. Ja entered my body, and I felt both pain and love simultaneously. As I looked to the ceiling above, I cried silently, and the words of the Isley Brothers' Voyage to Atlantis played in my head. As the first warm tear rolled into my ear, I whispered to him, "Promise you'll always come back to me. Promise you'll always come back to me, please." With his cheek against my tear-soaked face, he promised me. I believed him. Ja and I went at each other in this fashion over the next 5 days. The phone rang and there were knocks at the door, but he didn't seem to care. Neither did I. He made it okay for us to disappear into our own lust-filled world. He was in the same place I was, pure bliss. I was a virgin before him in so many ways, and on that night, the cherry was popped on the rest of my life. To me, he was my first real lover since G, and I ate him alive. That first night turned into 5 days, and by the time the rest of Murder Inc. was allowed in the room, we were both in heaven. We began to sing each other's praises like jocks in a locker room as I began to recite a verse from Jadakiss. I know a bitch named Superhead. She gives superhead. She just moved into the building. She even gave the superhead. We all laughed. And then between us, the name stuck. It was an insider stroke that was supposed to forever remind us of the first time Ja and I connected. It and I belonged to Murder Inc. However, the rest of the close knit hip hop industry would soon catch wind of our little joke and would quickly turn it into something not so funny. What started out as an incredibly personal pet name eventually and quickly turned into my scarlet letter. It would be taken out of context from that day forward. On our last day, Ja left the room before I woke up. I felt energized and was ready to see the world again. I looked around for something to take with me, something that would smell like him but wouldn't be missed. On the floor, I found a balled up sock and placed it to my face and got the fix I was searching for. I could smell his skin and the aroma of the hotel room, and that would be enough to hold me until I could see my love again. Ice and I hadn't seen each other much, and the only time we really spoke was when I ran out of money. He supported my spending habits and helped me take care of my son's needs. Ice never demanded any of my time. He understood me and knew I had to go out and find my own way. With the lessons he taught me, like where to go to meet influential people and how to dress and speak, he always knew I would be okay. It's why my love for him is genuine and complete. So, with a decent amount of money at my disposal, I was able to pay someone to take care of my son around the clock while I shopped and gradually became the quintessential urban socialite, albeit one with access to hip hop royalty. Fred Durst and I continued to stay in touch, and soon we had our official first date. We met at P.F. Chang's at the Beverly Center Mall for lunch, and even though we had spoken quite a bit, I was still extremely nervous around him. I remember feeling like I had to try extra hard to impress him, as if I just wasn't good enough. He was different from the others. He wasn't flashy and flamboyant. He was more laid back and introverted. I never knew what he was thinking and wanted to be sure he had no reason to not like me. We sat and talked and got to know each other more, but something happened at the table that stayed with me. Fred ordered 5 different entrees just for himself. I was confused but didn't want to seem young and inexperienced, so I just watched his movements. He seemed to be the same as me, a bit depressed and lonely, a stranger to love, and searching. He opened up to me about himself, and I felt special. Just as his story was getting good, our food was served. My 1 plate, and his 5. For the next 45 minutes, while we sat there in the booth and discovered each other, I watched him move. He was grand, taking tiny forkfuls from each dish and repeating that move a few times. Then, just that fast, he was done, leaving the majority of the food behind. I was in awe. I had never really wasted food before, and right then I knew that one day I would be able to eat whatever I wanted, however much I wanted, and summon someone to take the plates away. In my inexperienced mind, it was the height of glamour. With all of the tattoos, body piercings, and one way of dress, Fred had an air of prestige to me. I silently hoped for him to want me. After we ate, I accompanied him to the studio to watch him record. He let me read his lyric book. He'd written the most hateful words about love and the lack thereof. There were pictures he had drawn of people he knew and images which were unrecognizable and disturbing at the same time. Still, I only wanted him more. I wanted to love him, to heal him. I felt he might want the same, and perhaps that's why he was sharing so much of himself with me. He took several pictures of me with his digital camera. It was the first time I had seen one. He took close up pictures of my breasts, which he wanted to put on his computer for him to admire at his leisure. Crazy as it sounds now, I thought the idea was sexy at the time. That night, I begged him to take me with him, but he resisted. Instead, he walked me to my car, where I found a $40 parking ticket, which I ripped to pieces before settling into my car for the lonely drive home. But before I made it to the driver's seat, I turned around right into a kiss. His kiss. Those few moments were like hours to me. His lips were soft and surprisingly full as I sucked his kiss. Please don't make me go, I begged. Please. Fred looked right through me with those eyes of his and said, I have to. I opened my car door slowly, hoping he would change his mind within the 8 seconds it would take me to sink into my seat. As he looked on, that's exactly what I did. I sank into my seat, closed the door, and through my tears, found my way back to the hotel. Early spring was also when I met one of the most significant members of the hip hop community. He is so different from the rest, I refuse to name him. For the sake of identity, I will call him Papa. I remember seeing Papa on television when I was a 13-year-old girl. Videos were new to me, and although I wasn't familiar with hip hop, I was becoming familiar with him. I would race home from school just to catch Rap City on BET and hope they hadn't shown his video yet. Eventually, I got wise and started taping the episodes. I would freeze frame his face and stare at it, wishing I was older and out there in the world so I could bump into him somewhere, somehow. Fast forward 8 years, and there he was, standing right in front of me. I met Chuck on the set of yet another video shoot to hang out. Still new to the scene, I felt self-conscious. I wasn't like the other girls on the set. Despite my trysts with Ice-T and Ja Rule, I felt plain and unworthy. After years of hearing how worthless I was, from my mother and then from G, my self-confidence was wavering at best. As I looked around the set, trying to settle my nerves, I noticed him. I wanted to go over and say hello, to be as brash as I had been with Ja, but I couldn't move. Just as I was about to give up on the notion, Chuck called me over. I looked in Papa's direction and stopped breathing. I walked over, slowly, only looking at Chuck as if I hadn't noticed Papa standing there, as if I hadn't been seducing him with my eyes the entire night. As I was talking to Chuck, pretending to ignore Papa, he grabbed my phone out of my hand and walked away with it. Let me use this for a minute, he said. I thought it was strange, his needing my phone, but I was content just to have had some sort of contact with him. I continued talking to Chuck, and a few seconds later, Papa returned and placed the phone back in my hands. For some reason, without looking, I started clearing the screen. You're not clearing your screen, are you? Papa said. Yeah, why? I answered nervously. I couldn't believe we were actually having an exchange. Look at it, he said. I looked at the phone and felt like a child. How could I not have realized what he'd done? It was his phone number. What was the last number again? I smirked. 2. In person, Papa was just as I had imagined him to be 8 years before as I watched his videos. He was funny and charming, and his eyelashes curled perfectly above his almost squinty eyes. He had so much charisma and confidence. He was sure of himself and well respected among other men. I loved him instantly. Love, in a sense, had always been easy for me. I loved the idea of it, and I have loved many men in my life, but only one man would be the recipient of my ongoing devotion, no matter what. And that's why, although it felt awkward and artificial to call Cool G Rap Daddy, it was more than fitting to call the man who would steal my heart over and over again, Papa. Chapter 10. Around the Block. In April 2002, ICE had set me up in a 2-bedroom condo in Santa Clarita, about 30 minutes north of Beverly Hills. A few weeks later, he landed a great-paying gig on Law and Order Special Victims Unit and was headed to New York. ICE had been my safety net, and I knew that if I got myself into any trouble, he would help me out. But now, he had some bad news. Hey, babe, he said. I have to let you go. He said he was pretty sure that with the skills he had given me, I would be okay. You'll be more than okay, he said. You're going to make it, and when you do, find me and buy me a white Benz. I've held on to those words all of these years. I made the promise, and I meant it. Bye, Ice. Goodbye, baby girl. Meanwhile, Fred and I hadn't spoken much after our date, but Chuck insisted that Fred was really into me, so I naively continued to play cat and mouse with him via his voicemail. Once in a while, he would call me back. I wanted him more than ever, but he was elusive. I found myself fantasizing about him day and night. I made up things in my head, and whenever I did speak to him, I took all of his words to heart and sometimes even out of context. I wanted to believe that all those sparks I felt when we were together were real, that I didn't imagine them. Then finally, we got together. My hands shook as I drove to his office, speeding along the 405 freeway. I checked my makeup and popped a few mints. My breathing was heavy, and so were my expectations. Walking down the long hallway to his open door, I whispered to myself, relax and breathe. The office was officially closed, so most everyone in the building was gone for the day, with the exception of a few stragglers. As I approached Fred's doorway, I felt a quivering in my knees and thought I would just drop to the floor. His voice saved me. Close the door, he said. His workspace looked mostly like a living room, so I kicked off my shoes and joined him on one of the sofas. We talked for a while, but I really don't remember much of the conversation because as his lips were moving, all I wanted to do was inch closer to them. I didn't want to talk. We'd done enough talking. I wanted my turn on this ride. So while he was in mid-sentence, I interrupted by gently biting, then pulling his bottom lip. He grabbed the back of my head and fused our mouths together. I grabbed onto his flesh and heaved myself across his lap, straddling this wild man. Before I could begin to own this intensity, I was on my knees. I looked at his pierced penis with a sick admiration. He was what I wanted, and to actually hold him in my hand at that time felt like a privilege. He was allowing me to finally have him, to taste him, and again, I felt powerful here. I was turned on by the fact that this was a man who so many women wanted, and this man wanted me. On stage, he commanded crowds of people, millions, and at this very moment, I commanded him. It was as if he and I traded places in the world, and I was important. At that moment, and moments like that, I didn't feel inadequate or mediocre. Make me come and I'll marry you, were the only words I remember Fred saying to me. I was so caught up that for a hot minute, I might even have believed him. But before I knew it, my power trip was over. Few words were spoken, and I was basically dismissed. Leaving was awkward and plain awful. Reality set in. I'd allowed myself to be seduced by the dream, and the wake-up call was harsh and unpleasant. I left Fred's office feeling dejected, and even more than that, naive and silly. After my encounter with Fred Durst, I was in need of a self-esteem boost. I looked up Ja Rule, and we continued to hang out throughout the summer. Our nights consisted of plenty of sex, drugs, and liquor. We walked around the hotel in our robes. His suite always seemed to be full of people, label execs, other artists, women, hangers-on, you name it. We drank heavily and popped ecstasy pills in rapid succession. We traveled in huge numbers and bounced from club to club. I felt I was a part of something real for the first time in my life. I was liked and accepted, and the perks were addicting. We could go anywhere and do anything. Everyone watched when we moved, and all the other girls wanted to come along. I was where other people wanted to be, and I felt special. There are quite a few memories of my time with Ja that will always stay with me. We used to have deep conversations about anything and everything. We spoke about his personal struggles and career plans. He spoke tenderly of his family, his grandmother, and his sister who died some time before. In tribute to her, he has a tattoo of her name and angel wings on his back. In the midst of my tryst with Ja Rule, I still longed to be involved with Papa, but he was ignoring me. For 4 straight months, I called with no response. Yet, I refused to give up. I needed the acknowledgement. Then he finally called me. When I heard his voice on the other end of the phone, my eyes began to tear. I was exasperated, but remained composed. The meeting was set, and I was on my way. As I was getting closer to the studio to meet Papa, I began to notice that familiar feeling of insecurity. My hair wasn't right, my clothes weren't right, and I just wasn't up to par. But when I arrived at the studio and began to take the long, winding walk to the back room, all eyes were on me. My self doubt disappeared with each step. When he saw me again for the first time in 4 months, his eyes seemed to dance. He instantly grabbed his backpack, and we left. We talked all the way to his hotel. He made me laugh, and then, to my surprise, I made him laugh too. He was really listening to me and liked what I had to say. It was as if we'd known each other for years and we were friends. I didn't feel nervous or inadequate. I felt beautiful and appreciated. I was dizzy with delight, and for a moment the reality whizzed through my head. I was with him. I had admired him from afar as a young girl and dreamed of this moment almost a decade before, and here he was, and he was interested in me. As we walked into the Beverly Hills Hotel bungalow, an overwhelming need to prove my worthiness came over me. It was as if I had to show him I was worth keeping around, that I was worthy of his presence. I had to thank him for choosing me and do it in a fashion that would make him want to keep choosing me for years to come. Once again, I turned to sex. He sat in a chair in the living room and turned on the television. I'm pretty sure that there was some sort of verbal exchange, but I blocked it out. The only thing I registered was the insatiable need to feast, to take from him. I needed to feel his energy and rock him to the core. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees before him and began to tear away at his clothes. His reaction was surprising, as if he didn't expect this. But after he found his home in the warm, wet confines of my mouth and throat, he lay back and exhaled. My body was on fire, and as I worked on Papa, I began ripping away at my clothes. I was at home here with him. I loved his body and this part of him that I wanted to ingest. He moved around in that chair to the point that it lifted off its front feet. There was a sort of levitation happening as we moved to the bedroom. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let our skin separate. It was as if he became my lifeline, my sexual IV. For the next 6 hours, he filled me up and then drained me. He pounded and he stroked and he made me want to live and die at the same time. I thought my heart would stop and that I would take my last breath there on that bed. We were wet and sticking to each other, and with every breath he let go, I sucked in. He pulled me and pushed me and threw my body around, having his way. And from that day on, he would be my papa. Yet, just like that, he too was gone. He just got up and walked out. It was 6 in the morning, and he had a flight to catch. His home was a long way from Los Angeles, but I knew he'd be taking a part of me with him, which made me feel satisfied for the moment. I twirled around that hotel room like a schoolgirl with a new dress. I was walking on air. I was ready. I just wasn't sure for what. Although I was hanging out with hip hop's elite and enjoying the best restaurants, had access to any club or party, and wore the hottest fashions, I had nothing to call my own or to support me and my son. When Ice-T left for New York, my sense of stability quickly faded. There was no safety net. So in many respects, I was back to square one. Not to mention, my drinking and experimentation with drugs had begun to get out of control, and I hadn't spent much time at all with my son. I became a hustler of sorts, bouncing in and out of strip clubs and selling myself in every way. I had gotten to a very desperate point where I could only have sex if it was accompanied by perks. I expected and received money from every man in my life, especially celebrities. I used sex to keep them happy, and when they were happy, they were generous. I needed to survive now that Ice was gone, and I didn't know any other way. Plus, I'll be honest, I was good at using sex to get what I wanted and needed. That's all I knew. In addition to using sex and depending on it to get what I wanted, I couldn't be alone. So I would pack clothes for a week or two and just bounce around. The condo had nothing in it really because it wasn't a home, and I had no idea what it took to turn it into one. Ice taught me a lot of things about Los Angeles and survival, but no one ever taught me how to live. I did experience genuine happiness around this time. I became involved with a young man. I was 21, emotionally going on 35, and he had just turned 18 but physically looked much younger. I had seen him at a party the day before we met. We noticed each other, and those 3 seconds became 6 as we moved in slow motion around each other. Just as quickly, I blinked and he was gone. The following night, after another party, a girlfriend said she knew him and would take me to his house. Although he just turned 18, he already had his own home and vehicle and lived very much the life of an adult. We were let in by his cousin, who said Ray was sleeping upstairs. Soon, Ray stumbled down the stairs, having just woken up and coming off of a late night out. His eyes opened wide and were immediately drawn to me. Almost like there were clouds under his feet, he floated toward me, and we were introduced. Hi, I'm Ray. You know him as Ray J, the younger brother of singer Brandy. Not much else about that night was committed to my memory, but it began one of the happiest times in my life. It was easy to fall in love with Ray. He brought back a part of my youth that had been stolen from me years ago. Ray was single with no children, which equals no drama. And at that time, I lived my life the same way. So much so that I never told Ray about my son, or anything else about me for that matter. When I went out with him, I felt official. I was a girlfriend, and that's entirely different from being just a lover. Ray and I spent months together as I juggled him and Papa like a circus act. My relationship with Ray made Papa uncomfortable and even furious. Papa knew everything about me and accepted me just the way I was. But the one thing he could never tolerate was me loving someone else. And I loved Ray J. It was the first time since Papa and I met that I had given so much attention to another man. It was not normal, and Papa didn't appreciate the change. Now, when Papa needed me, I wasn't always available. This new relationship was special to me because with Ray J, I had someone to spend time with in public, as a couple. We held hands and let people know we were together. I was proud of that. Because Ray is a member of a tight-knit, well-known family, it's not surprising that they didn't approve of me. They knew I was older than him, and they were concerned for him. What's more, before meeting me, Ray had just gotten out of a long-time relationship with one of the members of the girl group 702. His family had become accustomed to her being a part of his life, and here I was, a virtual stranger. Eventually, however, certain members of his family accepted us, and we were free to enjoy our relationship. When Ray and I made love, we would go for hours on end, each hour more satisfying than the last. Being with Ray was always sweet and innocent. His kisses were long, and his lips were full and light as they met mine. He was young and still a bit inexperienced, and shied away from oral sex, but he would kiss all around my lower regions and make my body quiver just the same. It was with Ray that I discovered my ability to orgasm without penetration or copulation. I would be excited just from his touch. Ray was with me because he liked me. It was pure, and this purity was so new to me that it had become more erotic than being with any other lover. After our lovemaking, we would pass out, him holding me, and me feeling loved. Ray and I created a stir around town, and people began to wonder what it was I saw in him. He was so young and wasn't yet respected as a major player among men. What no one could have possibly realized was that it took a younger man to make me feel young again. We were silly together, and we enjoyed spending long afternoons and nights together. We saw our favorite movies, like Big Mama's House, starring Martin Lawrence and Neil Long, 3 or 4 times, and enjoyed them each time as if it were the first time. I felt free with Ray. He awakened a desire in me to get my youth back and hold on tight. Ice had come and gone, and Fred was out of the picture. But my relationship with Ja was ongoing and became more intense as we ate, drank, and slept together. Our sex became a constant in my life, and he himself became the drug. I was also hooked on the atmosphere. Being around Ja Rule and Murder Inc. felt like being around family, the one feeling I had always longed for. We all knew we were up to no good, and I loved it. That is, until I found out that not only was Josh still in a relationship with his teenage sweetheart, but they were also expecting their second child. I entered my relationships with Ice, Ja, and Papa, knowing they had other women, though none was married. I remember the first time it really registered for me that Ja had another relationship and responsibilities, separate and apart from the carefree, wild life he led in Los Angeles. It was early one morning at the hotel, and whoever the other girl was we'd brought back with us the night before was gone. It was not uncommon for Ja and me to pick up other women and have threesomes. We were wild and disregarded all the conventional rules and authority. The phone rang, and I stayed quiet as Ja answered. The woman on the other end of the phone was frantic, not letting him get as much as a word in. All he could squeeze in was, "What girl? Somebody told you what?" He eventually slammed the phone down while the woman was still in mid rant. He pulled me close as I lay on his chest, and we passed out. That's how it was with Ja. One crazy adventure after the next, and I was so out of it then that there are a lot of things I've long since forgotten. But then there are some incidents that I will never forget, like the night I thought Ja was going to die. We were getting ready to go out, as usual, and true to form, we started popping ecstasy pills and guzzling Remy Martin straight from the bottle. It seems as if he took more than usual from the time we woke up until about 10 at night. This was a little scary. He had disappeared for a while to another room, probably to be with other girls, which was also common. About 45 minutes later, there was a soft, weak knock at the door. I opened it, and there he stood, in a cold sweat. He was shaking and having a hard time walking. There were a few other girls in the room with us, and they all just stood there, watching. They were new to our clique. They didn't know Ja like I knew him. I led him into the bathroom, but before he could make it, he began to throw up. At the time, I was so caught up with Ja that all I was thinking was that I needed to protect him. I didn't want any vomit to touch his skin. I cared deeply for this man, regardless of anything or anyone else. Ja purged for a few minutes, and just like that, he was better. I offered to get him some water, but he refused. Instead, he grabbed the Remy bottle, guzzled, and we kept the party going. Sadly, he was amazing that way. He never stopped. He was always on when others were around. Meanwhile, Papa and I stayed in touch constantly. He had been working in Los Angeles a lot, and I jumped at the chance to see him. He became my refuge at times. Unlike with Ja and Murder Inc., there were no wild parties, no entourages, no other girls, and no self-abuse. Our time together was quiet and special. We watched movies and ordered room service. He would preview his projects and let me hear his work. My favorite memories of him are of him giving me private live shows in his boxers. Most of all, we were friends. Friends who also had incredible sex. I accepted early on that no man is perfect. Although Papa was being unfaithful, he loved and valued his family and fiercely protected them from his life as an entertainer. I respected Papa's space and his privacy, and do so even now. It gave me chills when he spoke to his family in front of me. I felt privileged to be with him, a man who was so loved by the people in his life. He brought me a certain sense of calm. But it was typical of me to further complicate things. So, it should be no surprise that somehow Dr. Dre entered the mix. Chuck introduced Dre to me a week after I arrived in Los Angeles. Nothing happened right away, but when I visited Chuck on the set of one of Dre's videos, things quickly took a familiar turn. I met Dre at the Universal City Hilton near Universal Studios on June 8, 2000. Far from the luxury of L'Hermitage in Beverly Hills, Dre and I met in the hotel's lobby lounge, where we ordered drinks and made small talk. It was uneasy and awkward. We both knew what we were there to do, and I couldn't figure out why we were stumbling around it. I didn't find him terribly attractive, physically or even sexually, and our personalities didn't particularly mesh, but power is an overwhelming thing. I felt important sitting there with him. Everyone knew his face, and I'm sure they suspected he was up to no good, being at the Hilton around midnight with a woman. But here in Hollywood, it's common and often expected. Room 2257 was small and quaint, but it didn't matter. I knew he wouldn't be staying long, so I cut the conversation short and joined him under the sheets. It was still very awkward, and it wasn't as if he drove me mad like Ja or Papa or even Fred. I felt nothing. I just knew this was an important man, one of the highest paid, biggest selling artist producers in the world. As he got on top of me, I was empty and cold. I stared at his face, his eyes, and it was only when I ran his resume and status through my head that my insides began to feel warmer. He left shortly afterward, and I was okay with that. Thinking back on it, I really don't know what led me to that hotel room and into Dre's bed. It was another example of my doing without thinking, for all the wrong reasons. I hopped back on the merry-go-round and ran back to Ray, back to that place where I was safe and where having sex felt natural. Around this time, Ray had begun to work on an album. I remember vividly the night he recorded the song that would change everything. Where Do We Go From Here was a song about meeting someone and spending so much time with them, even beginning to love them and wanting to know if it could or should be more. Ray stood in the recording booth, belted out that song, and accompanied it with tears. He cried, and I cried witnessing it. I loved this boy so much and wanted nothing more than to stay with him. But I knew that one day I would have to go, that one day he would know who I had been with and render me unworthy of the affection he was now showing me. As much as I loved Ray, I was too deep in my lifestyle with an undeniable reputation to go back. I was still greedy. I wanted it all. I wanted Ray's love. I wanted the carefree, bling-filled lifestyle of hanging with the likes of Ja and the laid-back, mind-blowing sex and friendship I relished with Papa. And more than anything, I wasn't ready to settle down. The first time I tried to settle down with a man led to my wanting to die. I wasn't going back there. So I knew the end for Ray and me was near and inevitable. Later that night, when the recording of the song was finished, we lay in bed and played it over and over. We held on to each other and cried silently. It was all so overwhelming, and I knew that night he loved me too. Before long, it was time for him to go away and record in Atlanta. I knew the separation would be difficult, but I really thought we could make it. What I didn't know was that by this time, Ray was beginning to find out about me, and we were growing apart. I deeply wished I were someone different, that I was a normal girl without all the baggage, the sordid past. But I was who I was, and I had done what I had done. It was impossible to turn back. I couldn't undo all of the abuse and the men. If he wanted to leave, I couldn't stop him. Hell, I couldn't blame him. What I could do, what I was also very good at, was run. And that's what I did. I ran right to Papa again. I ran to the man who accepted me and away from the boy I knew couldn't afford to. He was still in an impressionable stage of his life, and just the way I had swept in and made him think I was wonderful, his friends and peers in the industry would soon prove to him that the image I portrayed was all an illusion. I almost wanted Ray to hate me so we could end it right there, quickly. In order to protect my heart, I wanted to let go first because I knew he was about to do the same to me. So that's what I did. Late on a Saturday night, I called Ray and told him all about me and Papa. Naturally, he wasn't happy. He said some awful things to me, called me horrible names, and slammed down the phone. What he couldn't have known is that for the next 6 months, I cried every day for him. I genuinely missed him more than I'd missed any other man I'd ever known. When he hung up that night, it closed the door on a relationship that I still treasure. However, this thing with me and Ja wouldn't stop. We spent a lot of time together, and as the months passed, he gained more and more notoriety as an artist and as a Hollywood bachelor. There were girls everywhere, and my position in his life became blurred. I was beginning to feel as if my time with him would be up soon. How right I was. I was at Chuck's office one day just shooting the breeze when I picked up a copy of a music magazine. There was an article celebrating hip hop dads and their kids. This must have been around Father's Day. The magazine featured 5 or 6 fathers, including Ja. I knew he had a daughter who was about 5 at the time, but the article went on about him and his longtime girlfriend and how she was expecting another child. Although it was known that Ja had been with his teenage sweetheart for years, I found out in that article that while Ja and I had been together in Los Angeles, she was at home in New York, pregnant. The Ja I knew and the life he led, I chuckled to think of him as this family man. I thought to myself, she's so stupid. I felt as if I was the one who knew everything. I was the gatekeeper of the treacherous secrets of his life while he was in Los Angeles. I finished the article with a smile on my face until the last line. She was 5 months pregnant. It was the exact amount of time that I had been in his life. My heart sank, and I couldn't blink as my eyes swelled with tears. Who was stupid now? Who was getting the real Ja? Not me, and not any of the other women who'd been part of his world. We were all replaceable and temporary. She, however, was permanent. Later that night, I met up with him at a local club. All of his friends and label mates were there, so I tried for a long time to hide my pain. I laughed and ordered drinks, danced around, and popped pills. I tried to appear normal, but inside, everything was different. He mingled and flirted relentlessly with other women. I felt the heat of jealousy crawling up my neck, blanketing my face. Then I blinked, took in a long, slow breath, and snapped. I grabbed champagne bottles and glasses, whatever I could find, and hurled them at his head. I ranted and raved, cried, and blurted out words that were sure to make him leave me right then and there. He seemed confused as he called out to me, "Come here! Come here, crazy girl!" I was afraid to move closer. There was a pool table between us, and that table may have very well saved my life. But even in the middle of all my chaos and acting out, he wouldn't let any of the others restrain me. It was like we had an unspoken understanding. He knew I was hurt and that my outburst could be justified. He might not have known exactly what caused it, but he knew that there was enough possibilities to choose from. He knew it was time, that it was the end. I left the club shortly after and drove recklessly, crying uncontrollably. Like with any breakup, even if it's the right thing to do, I started to have regrets about my temper tantrum. I wasn't sure I was ready for it to be over, despite the reality check. I didn't want to drive all the way home to my empty condo. Instead, I wanted him to tell me he understood why I had snapped and that I could be with him for the night. I wanted him to touch me like he had before, like he did on that first night. So instead of going home, I drove to that familiar street where my life in LA had all started. I drove to Orchid Avenue, parked in front of the Orchid Suites Hotel, and dialed his number. He sounded tired and uninterested in what I had to say, but didn't hang up. Ja, I'm sorry. It was the drinks, and then I took some E, and I just got all emotional. Baby, I'm sorry. I cried out to him to forgive me. I wanted him to feel sorry for me and to let me come to him. It's cool, Ma. Don't worry about it. The tone of his voice said it all. He was done with me. I sat in my car that night and cried until it hurt. My eyes, my throat, my chest, it all hurt. I sat there in my car, thinking about the hotel in front of me, wondering how I'd gotten into this mess. I wanted my old room back. I wanted to be back sitting among those outdated clothes. I wanted to undo the moment when I stepped into my first club, the moment when I popped my first pill. I wished I had never seen Ja's face or any of their faces. I wanted so badly to be a little girl minus the rape, the mother-daughter drama, and the men. The only beacon of light was my son and my relationship with Papa. He was all I had left. Back then, I just couldn't stand the idea of being alone. Chapter 11. Video Girl. By this time, I had known most of the employees at Def Jam Records and had visited their offices on Sunset Boulevard, which were perched on the top floor of the Hustler building. A girlfriend of mine and I had gone to an LL Cool J video shoot in order to meet with one of Def Jam's employees. Within seconds, my eyes landed on the person we were there to meet. We sat and talked for a few moments before another man came over and introduced himself to me. "Hey, I'm Hype," he said casually. "What are you doing next week?" I was taken aback and wasn't quite sure who he was. Yet I answered, "Nothing." He continued, "Okay, cool. Take my number and call me. You're gonna be in my next video. Get a tan." Then I realized that this was famed music video director Hype Williams. It would be my first video, and the following weekend I was on the set of Jay-Z's video for his single, Hey Poppy. Days before arriving on the set, I called Chuck to let him know that I would be working on the video. Chuck and Jay had been good friends for years, and I wanted Jay to know that I was coming. By this time, Chuck and I were closer than ever and continued to claim each other as cousins, though we weren't blood relatives. So Chuck made the call to be sure that once on set, I would be taken care of. Call time was early, around 6 in the morning. We were on location at Zuma Beach in Malibu, and all the talent had convened in the hair and makeup trailers to begin the long preparation process. I was a bundle of nerves, but tried my best to remain cool among the other girls. My heart raced, and I was excited to get up to the house where we would be working. I was anxious to meet Jay and introduce myself to him, since I was also a fan of his music. Finally, the moment arrived. We were shuttled up a winding hill to a palatial mansion overlooking Zuma. This was my first time in a house this size and in Malibu. This was also the first time Jay and I would speak. As soon as we unloaded from the van, I saw Jay standing poolside in front of Hype and his camera. I quickly made my way over to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Isette," I said. "Chuck's people." "Yeah?" he said. "What's up? Chuck told me you was coming. Come on, you stand by me all day today." And that was it. For the rest of the day, I stood as close as possible to Jay. I became acquainted with his entourage as well as his partner, Damon Dash. The performer in me was evident throughout the day as I did the most outrageous things possible, like wearing an ultra skimpy string thong bikini, while the other girls proudly sported modest, full back bikinis and one piece bathing suits. The atmosphere became tense between me and the other girls almost instantly. The majority of girls on video shoots are reserved and are there strictly to do their jobs. As a silent rule, the feature girls never fraternized with the artists and, in many cases, actually looked down their noses at the artist. They walked with their heads high, rolling their eyes and sucking their teeth as the artists, and mostly the entourage, tried to catch the girls' attention. I seemed to be the only one being chummy with Jay, Damon, and the others. I was in my element. These people were acquaintances of Chuck and were aware that I was G-Rap's ex and the mother of his youngest child. Jay took care of me that day, making sure I got good exposure and anything else I needed. The day went well, although it started off unpleasantly for some. By 9 o'clock that morning, Damon Dash had already been drinking. He emerged from the pool house with a bottle of Belvedere vodka in his right hand. He was staggering as he walked alongside the pool where we were shooting. I watched intently, mainly waiting for him to fall into the pool, but he did not. Instead, he fell about 7 feet away from the pool and lay flat on his back with his arms and legs outstretched, vodka still in hand. "Damon, are you all right?" I went over to him. "Damon." He gave no answer. I straddled his body while on all fours, leaning my face close to his. To the left of us was photographer Arnold Turner, snapping away with his camera. Finally, Damon stuttered, "Yeah, I'm cool." Jay then motioned for someone to get Damon off the ground and off the set. Shooting of the video was halted while Damon got himself together. That was my first introduction to Damon Dash. Years later, he would play a substantial role in changing my life. Jay and I forged a silent rapport that day, which would continue for years to come. I felt comfortable around him and felt that it was all right for me to accept his invitation to take a ride with him down from the house and onto the beach. We hopped in the back of his chauffeur-driven Mercedes S55 and took the windy road back to the shore of Zuma Beach. He asked me if I was doing all right on my first day and briefly asked me about my relationship with G. We continued to talk for a while until his driver parked on the beach and exited the vehicle. After a few moments of silence, Jay pulled out his penis, covered it with a condom, and placed his hand on the back of my head. I was being a good girl, thanking him and proving my worthiness of the kindness he had shown. I was doing what I had been taught. We carried on in the car for a while and headed back to the set as if nothing happened, and every once in a while we shared a glance and half of a smile. Jay and I would remain acquainted over the next few years. As he evolved into one of the most successful and influential players in not only hip hop, but in pop culture, we bumped into each other on other video shoots, at events, and at private gatherings. Unlike some of the others, there were no games, no long phone conversations, and no dates. Jay made no professions of love for me, nor did he make any promises. It was all very straightforward. It was what it was, nothing more. Since that day in the car, he remained a gentleman, and it seemed as if nothing had ever happened between us. And in a way, nothing had. After my initial introduction into the world of hip hop video making, it was full steam ahead. I began getting calls from the top casting directors in town at least once a week. I rarely had to audition for videos and would be hired strictly by past performances or by requests from the artist. The next video I was up for came 1 week after shooting Hey Poppy. This shoot would prove to be more challenging than the one before because this one was for Ja Rule's single, Between Me and You. He and I had not spoken since our relationship went sour. I was pretty sure I would not be allowed to stay on set once he saw me, but I did all I could to remain. When I got to the mansion overlooking Malibu, I found I was one of the first to arrive. There were very few girls and no sign of the crew or the video's director, Dave Myers. I put my things in the pool house, which was set up as a base camp for the girls, and quickly used this time to work on my already glowing tan from the week before. Wardrobe gave me a white bikini to wear. I took my spot in the sun and lay on my stomach in the closest lounge chair. Without a second thought, I undid the top portion of my suit and proceeded to sunbathe. Without it. As more girls began to arrive on set, along with the label representatives and crew, I could hear the dull roar of whispering. The other girls were appalled and the men were shocked, but definitely not upset by my nudity in any way. I knew that there had to be something different about me in order to catch the attention of Dave Myers. It's always a good idea to become the director's favorite and be able to bypass the whole auditioning process to make more money than the other girls in the long run. I had a plan in mind and put its wheels in motion. I had been on set topless for about an hour when the director arrived. The cameramen and crew were all set up for the first shot of the day. Upon seeing my oiled, naked breasts glistening in the sun, Dave Myers grabbed his camera and began to film. It was film magic as I gave Dave what he wanted. Just the art of it excited me, and knowing that all the other women hated it heightened my excitement and made me want more of this sort of attention. I never really had girlfriends, so the idea of not getting along with other girls on set was not a deterrent for me. There was always someone trying to compete with me and trying to eliminate me. It started with my mother and continued throughout my adult life. On this particular video shoot, there was another woman who thought she could compete with me. I met her in New York, where she worked alongside Irv Gotti, CEO of Murder Inc. I knew from Irv that she and he had been involved. Once Keisha saw that I was on the set of Between Me and You, she called Irv, and he made his way to the set to tell me I had to leave. He said there was a rumor that I had a plan to have him and Josh set up to be robbed. The accusations floored me and were totally unfounded. I begged him to believe me and let me stay. Irv grabbed me by my arm and escorted me into his SUV and drove me down the hill to a row of trailers that sat in a sandy patch of land. I began to cry. I didn't want him, or Ja especially, to believe that I would have done such a thing. The truth was that when I was with Ja, I was with Murder Inc. I felt as if I was a part of them. I had a different kind of love for Ja that I always carried with me, and I didn't want him to think I would turn on him. I told Gotti that I would do anything to be able to stay. I would do anything for him to believe me. I told him how much I loved all of them and considered them friends and would never plot against them. If you really mean what you say, then show me, he said, clearly aroused. Unfortunately, this was a familiar scene for me, and there in the trailer, I apologized to him for anything I might have done, and even for things I had not, and he forgave me. After my apology to Gotti, we returned to the set together. He let Ja, Keisha, and everyone know that it was cool for me to stay and that the entire situation had been a misunderstanding. I was back in, and no matter what it cost me, namely my dignity and self respect, happy to be there. It was evident to me that Keisha thought of me as being less than her. In her mind, I could easily be discarded as, no doubt, many girls had been before. However, on that day, her seniority over me was overridden. From that day on, Keisha and I would have a silent feud. Not only did she not replace me on the video set, but I replaced her as Gotti's lover. It's funny how back then our disdain for each other seemed important and just, but in retrospect, we weren't that different after all. We were both smart women who deserved so much more than feuding about who stayed on the video shoot and who got priority in Gotti's bed. The rest of the video shoot went off without a hitch. Ja and I resolved our past issues and even posed for pictures together while I unbraided his hair in the jacuzzi. I was back with the ink. By the end of the shoot, I was sure that I had gained a few enemies in the other girls, but I'd also gained a friend in Dave Myers, who looked out for me professionally. My next few videos would be strictly for Dave Myers, but soon I found myself working with many other prominent directors and artists in the business. The next high profile video I would appear in was Mystical's Danger, directed by Little X. This single was a much awaited follow up to the mega hit Shake Your Ass. By this time, I figured out that the only videos to go out for were those that would get regular daytime spins on MTV and BET. And being with G taught me a lot about the music industry and the economics of it. At this time, the budgets for videos were massive, many reaching into the millions. The more popular an artist became, the more radio spins he had, and the more MTV and BET spins, the more likely he was to be in the top 10 on Billboard. Once an artist reached that type of status, even with just one previous single, the budgets became more substantial, and I would do the most outrageous things possible to be in those kinds of videos. Whatever the other girls wouldn't wear, I would wear. Whatever the other girls wouldn't do, I was up for. I knew such behavior would increase my worth as a performer, and therefore I would be able to command more money above and below the table while pleasing both the artist and the label alike. On this particular shoot, the conditions were harsh. I can't recall the exact time of year, but it was still chilly in Los Angeles and even colder 50 miles north of Los Angeles in the desert, which is where we were filming. The location was a Western saloon that stood literally in the middle of nowhere. The dusty road that led to the location was barren, except for the occasional roadkill, which in that neck of the desert consisted mostly of wild boars and armadillos. It was about 40 degrees, and the wind was whipping sand around at about 15 miles an hour. We were all miserable. However, I had a job to do. When it came time to choose our wardrobe, the stylist had been asking a few girls if they were willing to wear pasties with their Western inspired outfits and boots. Every girl refused. I was one of the last girls to get dressed. I had been busy speaking with Mystical, who I met months before at L'Hermitage in Beverly Hills. By this time, he and I had been closely acquainted and had spent many days and nights together around town. So by the time I got to the wardrobe trailer, there were very few items left in it, and nothing that could be deemed shocking, which is what I was looking for. Then the stylist asked the question, "What do you think about these?" In her hands lay two gold star pasties. I stalled for a moment to think of the ramifications of wearing gold stars over my nipples. Minutes later, with the scent of eureka in the air, I smiled. I love them. I covered myself with a long plush white robe that I had gotten from L'Hermitage so the other girls would not see the outfit I was wearing before filming began. I waited around for hours and even fell asleep while waiting for my scenes. Then, finally, the reveal. I could sense the overwhelming tension in the room as I dropped my bathrobe and hopped on top of a table to dance. The other girls, as usual, were both shocked and appalled, maybe even a little disgusted. But once Mystical got onto the set and saw my outfit, he gave me his stamp of approval. Not only was I wearing the gold star pasties, but also chaps, with only an ostrich skin thong underneath so that my rear was fully exposed. If shocking was what I was going for, I had outdone myself. For the remainder of the shoot, I continued to perform and receive the majority of attention from both Little X and Mystical, as well as the full attention of the MTV camera crew and a reporter who came to film a documentary called When Sex Goes Pop. Once the camera crew and the reporter caught a glimpse of my outrageous costume, all of the attention and cameras were focused on me. At one point, the manager of singer Nivea, who was featured on the single, complained to the camera crew that his artist was the star and she was not being interviewed, yet I was. It was a testament to the old adage that sex sells. The rest of the shooting day and the following day went smoothly. By the end of it all, I knew that I had again created and sustained many enemies within the core group of girls who worked on many of the same videos as me. Most women on video shoots are professional women who are represented by top commercial agencies. As I said before, it is very rare for a principal model to talk to an artist, and many times they look down on the artists. I was breaking all the rules as I cavorted with many of the artists that I worked with during and after shooting. It meant nothing to me compared to the acceptance of the men behind the production because they were in a position to determine my fate, both professionally and financially. Little X seemed impressed and excited about my performance, and we instantly exchanged numbers on the first day of shooting. He and I would work together at least once after Danger, but X would play a far more important role in my life. Mystical was equally pleased and praised me for making his video hot. We spent those nights together while filming the video, and he made sure I was taken care of financially for looking out. I was making around $1,500 a day for a minimum of 2 days, but after the Danger video aired, along with the accompanying When Sex Goes Pop documentary, my rate nearly doubled. I had learned to play the game, and everywhere I turned, I was being rewarded for my devilish behavior. My life had definitely changed since I'd moved to Los Angeles, but little did I know there would be a big difference between living in Los Angeles and arriving in Hollywood. Chapter 12. A Man Apart. During my first day of work on the set of A Man Apart, we shot one of the early scenes of the film. Once again, I found myself at a gorgeous beachfront home in Malibu's Zuma Beach, and I worked from 6 in the morning until around 6 in the evening. There was a perfect sunset on the horizon and a brisk chill in the air. Flocks of birds could be seen flying over the ocean as its waves crashed onto the shore. This was Southern California at its best. I was content with the work I had done and excited to be among the cast, crew, and director. Lorenz and I forged a pleasant friendship that would translate on screen. I would stay in character as his wife even during breaks in the shooting. I would make his plate at lunch and nitpick about his clothes and hair, making sure everything was in order. There were no actual romantic feelings between Lorenz and me, but I enjoyed being his wife for the duration of our time on A Man Apart. He was kind and very much a gentleman. On a few occasions, his mother and grandmother would visit him on set. It was easy to see where Lorenz had gotten his manners and respect for women. He was extremely grounded and humble, and made my job as a new actress easier. As a director, F. Gary Gray seemed to be extremely hands on. He saw to it that all of the cast members became acquainted with one another even before we began to shoot the film. He sent Lorenz and me on a few dinner and lunch dates strictly for that purpose. Gary was also very helpful to me and guided me through the entire process. He gave me a few pointers about acting, of course, but also made me aware of my body on camera. At the beginning of filming, I weighed in at 140 pounds. Gary explained that although I would be attractive to any man walking down the street, the camera would not be so kind and that I should lose weight immediately. And so I did. During a 2-week break from the film, during the holiday season of 2000 and early 2001, I lost 20 pounds before returning to set. How I lost the weight is another story, filled with cold Atlanta nights with a very young lover, Belvedere vodka. Gary also told me one other very important rule to making a successful picture. Under no circumstances was I ever to date or have sex with any of my male co stars. I was the only woman on set for the most part and seemed to stand out with my trademark walk. I had inherited the same sexy swagger that my mother and grandmother had all of their lives. It was like a cobra doing her dance of death right before the strike of her venomous bite, a form of peacocking I had used to entice men that had become second nature to me. Add that to my 38C breast size, 23-inch waist, and 38-inch hips and bottom, and it was obvious that there could be trouble on the set. I took Gary's advice to heart. After all, he did know best. But I have to admit, it was impossible at best. I had been paying close attention to Vin Diesel while on set, secretly listening to everything he said and following him around with my eyes. I loved it when he walked past me and hoped he would say something to me, something outside of the work that we had to do. But he remained professional, and I remained desirous. At the end of the first shooting day, I left the set and walked slowly to the row of trailers that were lined along the beach, beaming on the inside while trying to compose myself on the outside. I couldn't believe I was shooting a film and would actually be in a movie. I was watching the ocean in all its splendor and thought about how far I had come and all the places I would like to go from here. It seems as if my world had opened up and I'd been given a chance to change my life drastically. I thought that maybe all those days that I practiced my acceptance speech to the academy just might pay off. I reflected on a few of my favorite actors in movies, like Cary Grant in An Affair to Remember and Robert De Niro in The Deer Hunter. There is something very magical about the city of Los Angeles, which was magnified to its brightest from behind my rose-colored glasses. I began to see what the rest of the world in Hollywood had already known. This is a place of dreams. I continued my slow, lazy walk down the beach. Busy daydreaming, I passed a production trailer and then Gary's trailer. Without warning, I was grabbed around the waist and scooped into the next trailer. His strong, massive hands grabbed me by my shoulders and pulled me into his handsomely chiseled face. Reminiscent of a scene from Gone with the Wind, he pressed his lips firmly against mine. Then, as they parted, our tongues touched and then danced. I melted in his mouth as the sun began to set over Zuma Beach. Vin and I were breaking all the rules and falling for each other. I knew that what we were doing was forbidden, but it felt so right and so necessary. I had imagined this scene from the first moment I met him, but had never thought it possible. He had been changing his clothes and wore only his pants as his bare chest pressed against mine. I wanted to feel my skin and soft, round breasts against his hard, lean muscles. I wanted more than I could have at that moment, but what he was giving me was powerful, just the same. There had to be some sort of silent sexual tension. The entire time we were filming, I secretly fantasized about us making love on that very same beach. I wanted him, but for the first time that I could remember, I was afraid to show it. There must be something to say about the actions and effects of pheromones because we had no openly flirtatious exchanges. There was no indication, at least outwardly, that it was okay for him to approach me in this way, let alone kiss me. Vin must have just smelled it like an animal in the wild. The way he kissed me reflected that. The way I kissed him back confirmed it. After our first kiss, Vin and I spent many days and nights together. It seemed to be a quiet place in his life, sort of the calm before the storm. We were still able to go to clubs, and once we sat outside a club in his black on black SUV listening to music because he couldn't get in. No one knew who he was, and I was just getting to know him. We spent a quiet night or two back at my condo, talking in depth about our lives. I remember him asking me about music, about who was hot at the time and which CDs he should buy. I was stunned by how uncool and almost sheltered he seemed to be. Yet here was this beautiful man with an amazing body, blessed with an enviable eight-pack and an even more enviable sizable penis. His body was perfect, and the way he made love was slow and sensual and thoughtful. Between his gentle, passionate kisses, he frequently whispered, "Are you okay? Is everything all right?" Always to be sure that I got pleasure out of our lovemaking. The weight of his body on top of mine and the way his hands caressed every reachable inch of me while he stroked my inner core drove me wild. His kisses were soft and just wet enough. His lips were full and warm, and everywhere they went, I shook with full blown desire. I was so attracted to this plain, straight laced guy who had never owned an R. Kelly album or ever heard a Ja Rule record, even after they filmed The Fast and the Furious together. I liked him because he was the opposite of me and everyone I knew. He represented a new life that I could easily picture myself in. I found him easy to be with. He was fun and funny. I remember filming one particular scene where Vin's character, Sean, was just awakening from a coma. I sat there, watching him act brilliantly. Just as the camera focused on my face to catch my emotional reaction to his awakening, all I could think of was the first kiss we shared and the good sex we had been having. During every scene that we had together, I would glow in his presence and had to resist my telling grin and blushing cheeks. Like the scene where we were at the police conference, Lorenz and I were already there, and Vin walks in with the woman who played his wife in the film. I could feel myself glowing at the sight of him as my eyes stayed planted on his. I felt that it must have been obvious to everyone else, but no one knew. Not until now. I fell for Vin during the shooting of A Man Apart, but soon, The Fast and the Furious and Triple X would take Vin far away from me. Just as it is in music videos, there was a separation between cast and the extras. The cast members were treated like royalty. We would have all meals fully catered and be served the best of food and drink, while the extras were made to eat lunches brought from home and in a separate dining area away from us. That was part of the difference between actors protected by the Screen Actors Guild labor laws and those who were not. Extras are usually people trying to become covered by SAG and need to rack up a certain amount of hours worked in order to qualify for its benefits. Although A Man Apart would be my first feature, the amount of hours that I would be under contract with the film and the money I would be paid for my appearance in the film assured me a place in the Screen Actors Guild. I was officially an actress. I was doing something that literally millions of people try to do every day in Hollywood, and I hadn't even been trying. I had been told by agents and managers to never repeat the story of how I had been discovered because other actors would resent it. It was a sort of fairy tale only heard of in books or seen on television. There are young people, even today, sleeping on Hollywood and Sunset Boulevards who started out with the same dream that I'd had. They walk up and down those telltale boulevards, hoping to be discovered by a passing director or actor. I was discovered on the Boulevard of Broken Dreams and went straight into a co-starring role on a big budget Hollywood picture. I couldn't have asked for a more perfect Hollywood beginning. But that was just how my life seemed to be working itself out. Everywhere I turned, someone was there to change my life, mostly for the best, but sometimes for the worst. It didn't matter if I was at a Hollywood party or at my local grocer. A famous, wealthy, or powerful man would be behind or in front of me. People like Ice and Gary. It seemed as if no matter the type of mess I'd get myself into, there were certain things that had to happen, despite myself. Everyone I had come across had a purpose in my life, and with the type of breaks I was getting, I thought I was headed for better things. I was not lucky, but blessed. Being a Hollywood actress or anything else related to entertainment doesn't happen to many people who come from St. Thomas. On the island, the only focus for children is their education. The only dream is to graduate from high school, then college, then join the armed forces and or get a job. People rarely step outside that box. Many islanders stay on the island all their lives, never leaving, not even for vacation. They are islanders at heart and make those great Virgin Islands what they are, jewels in the Atlantic. Most natives need no more than what those 28 square miles have to offer. But I'd always been a dreamer, though I would soon learn the value of that old adage about being careful about what you wish for, courtesy of a certain NBA legend. Chapter 13, Mr. Big. When I began shooting A Man Apart, I was on top of the world, both professionally and financially. Working as an actress in a green lighted movie meant I no longer had to do things I didn't want to do to pay bills. I was free from having to strip in clubs or form relationships with wealthy men strictly to make financial ends meet. Every week, a check for $3,000 would arrive in my mailbox, whether I worked that week or not. Personally, it seemed as if I had what many girls dream of as well. Earlier that month, I had begun dating one of the most recognizable men in the world, and although he would not be the only man of such high visibility in my life, he would be by far the most generous. We had a mutual friend in John Sally, the former NBA player for the Detroit Pistons, and then on Fox Sports Net's Best Damn Sports Show period, who had set us up on a blind date. According to John, I was this man's type, and he is certainly yours. John gave this mystery man the directions to my place in Santa Clarita, just 30 minutes north of Beverly Hills, and I waited nervously for him to arrive. I heard a car's engine outside my window and the sound of a door slamming. My doorbell rang, and I answered the door with butterflies fluttering in my stomach. When I opened the front door, I was floored. It was NBA superstar, world champion, Olympic gold medalist Shaquille O'Neal. I had gone out with several high profile athletes and a few mega movie stars. He wasn't the biggest name wise, but he was the biggest in size. Shaq's presence was more overwhelming than that of any man I'd ever met. Shaq stands over 7 feet tall, weighs more than 300 pounds, and wears a size 26 shoe. When he greeted me at the door with a hug, I felt like a little girl as my cheeks pressed against his stomach. My face was lost in his huge hands as he held it to kiss my mouth. Shaq immediately began to look around my condo, checking for what I had and what I needed to have. My place was still very new. The walls were stark white, with only a small white leather sofa and black wrought iron coffee and end tables. There was a 25-inch television that I had gotten from a friend and no dining room set. I had no pots and pans, only disposable plates and utensils. My bedroom had a second-hand full-size bed and the sheets that came with it. My son's room was empty. The bathroom shower curtains were purchased at the local dollar store and were made of extremely thin plastic, which failed to protect the floor from spraying water. Although I had been living in my place for a while, it was all but barren. I spent so much time with other people like Ja Rule and Ray J, I rarely came home except to pack a new bag of clothes and maybe pay the bills every couple of months. My apartment was so empty that Shaq reached into his pocket and gave me a couple of $100 in cash. The next day, he arranged for $10,000 to be deposited into my bank account. Shaq was very upfront about the way the relationship would be. I won't be able to come see you a lot, so I'll just write checks to keep you happy, he said. He was charmingly self effacing about his sexual prowess and wanted to reduce my expectations. He essentially told me not to let his size fool me. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. No, I'm serious, he said. You may like it, or you may not. Either way, you'll be well taken care of. I found sex with him satisfying, although one might have bigger expectations for a man who stands over 7 feet tall and who weighs more than 300 pounds. Compared to other men, he was nothing to complain about. Shaq, or Big, as he is affectionately called, is reputed to be extremely arrogant and conceited, yet also extremely honest. But I saw him as a man who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it and made no bones about saying what it was. By giving me money that first night, he was saying, I own you now. We had our first sexual encounter that same night. It was my way of thanking him, since I'd always equated money with sex. Even though Shaq and I had sex that night, it seemed to be the furthest thing from his mind during the remainder of our relationship. Over the next 4 months or so, Shaq and I would be intimate maybe 2 or 3 times. My most prominent memory about our sex life is of the weight of his body and the enormous amounts of sweat that would soak my body, even through my mattress. On one occasion, I had to turn my mattress over to have a dry place to sleep once he left. Shaq is known to be a very generous man who loves to take care of the people around him, especially the women in his life, as long as they live by his rules. He changed my life at a time when I was so busy living other people's fantasies that I hadn't paid much attention to my own. He paid for all the things that I had been neglecting, and with the money he gave me throughout our short lived relationship, I was able to purchase my son's first bedroom set and furniture for every room in the house. He did, however, have a few specific requests, like a big screen television and a larger couch for him to sit on. He said that everything in my place had to be big because he was, and that he wanted to be comfortable when he came over. He was very protective. He didn't want me to have to do anything, not cook or clean. At his request, I hired someone to clean my house for me. He said that no woman of his should have to work. All of her attention should be focused on him. He also demanded that I not go out at all or speak to anyone, especially not about him. Most women would have been more than happy to accept his rules with no problem and no questions asked. Not me. I was so accustomed to the spotlight and living life my way, I refused to do what he asked of me. Naturally, it strained our relationship. After a few months of trying to work it out, things came to a head. There was no shouting or high drama. We went back and forth in short, clipped messages on our two-way pagers as I sat at the first table read for a man apart. My mind was barely on the scene we were reading because I was busy keying away in an effort to salvage what was left of this relationship. My attempts were futile because just like that, it was over between Big and me. I threw myself into my work on A Man Apart and threw myself at the man in A Man Apart, Vin Diesel. On my last day of shooting, Lorenz and Vin sent flowers to my trailer. I had gotten very accustomed to being with the cast and crew. Now it was all over, and I felt empty inside. I held back the tears as I was leaving the set and gave out smiles and hugs to the remaining cast members and F. Gary Gray, the film's director. But as soon as I got into my car, I laid my head against the steering wheel and began to cry uncontrollably. I cried all the way home and lay in bed for the next few days. I hadn't been around my old friends or the music industry for a while and soon began to make the phone calls that would get me back in. I craved the cars, the jets, and the yachts to which I had become so accustomed before shooting A Man Apart. I longed for the trips to the islands and abroad, even the shores of South Beach in Miami, and with the money I was making, I felt I would be well received. Maybe now I could be one of them. So I went back to hip hop, to its incredible highs, and very soon its devastating lows. But first, there was a detour. This is about the time I re-sparked my affair with Irv Gotti, head of the label which housed my former lover Ja Rule, as well as singer Ashanti. Gotti would call me every time he was in town, and even when he wasn't. When he called, I went to him. I did whatever he asked of me, and he would take care of me financially for the time that I spent with him and Murder Inc. I was a part of something when I was with them, but I was also a drug addict and an alcoholic. From sunup to sundown, we were surrounded by ecstasy and cognac. It was literally there for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I continued to be depressed after wrapping the movie and began to indulge even more in the dangerous habits that accompanied hanging out with this crowd. There was more sex, more intoxicants, and more unsavory behavior. I was paid to be the bad girl, but as long as I was wanted, I would have done whatever it took to stay in the mix. The things that went on while Gotti and I were together are almost unimaginable to me now, but in the haze of drugs and liquor, it all seemed all right. I was being used over and over again. There was man after man, all friends and acquaintances of Gotti's. I was doing what I was told by one of the most prominent men in my life, and now was well rewarded for my misbehavior. It's no secret that Gotti is not the most sensitive person around. In fact, he can be downright brutal. It's also no secret that Gotti was married with 3 children and kept lovers all around the globe. But I was his favorite. No matter where he was in the world, he would always find his way back to me. His wife knew of me and our relationship. I wasn't in love with Gotti by any means, but he was the gatekeeper to the lifestyle to which I'd become accustomed and addicted. And because of that, Gotti was in charge. I quickly became Gotti's showpiece. He would turn other people in the industry onto me. I was his party favor and became the new form of payola with label and radio heads. Whenever there was someone who Gotti wanted to impress, he would send me to them and I would take care of them. One of those people was Sean P. Diddy Combs. It was sometime after Valentine's Day 2001, just after Diddy and Jennifer Lopez had announced their split. Gotti and I had been spending the day drinking and popping ecstasy pills, as usual. The mixture of alcohol and X often made us extremely sexual, and we would have sex all day and night. As a lover, Gotti was insatiable. The drug drove him to unbelievable heights, and soon he began experimenting with Viagra. The sex became more like a boxing match than anything else. We would compete against each other, and on most every occasion, I would win. There were a few times when he actually got up and ran, and even locked himself in the bathroom in order to get away from me. Still, at other times, he got the sexual upper hand, and I would lie in bed, curled in a ball, feeling completely spent, which in my inebriated state turned me on even more. Gotti and I were a perfect match as lovers. On one particular night, we were riding around Beverly Hills in a limousine with Ja and other members of the Inc., and we ended up at Moomba, a club on the west side. We ventured through the club, entourage in tow, and made our way to the outdoor patio and out to the back parking lot. I stood there beside Gotti as Diddy walked up to him. They greeted each other with a slap of the right hand. Diddy held a drink in his left. He seemed to be as intoxicated as we were. I stood there looking at him while they spoke, and all of a sudden he turned and looked right at me. His conversation with Gotti was abruptly cut short as he took a few steps closer to me, grabbed my hand, and said, "I want you. Can I have you?" Then Diddy turned to Gotti and said, "My bad, dog. Is this you?" Gotti quickly said, Nah, it's cool. This is Set. She's cool people." "Can she come with me?" Diddy asked. I wanted to leave with Diddy right then. The ecstasy had me in a mood where whatever I felt normally was heightened 100%. Even the wind on my face made me orgasmic. Right there in front of me, Gotti and Diddy made arrangements for me to meet Diddy at his house in an hour. "I'll send her to you in a little bit," Gotti said. "Give me the address." I didn't understand why Gotti didn't let me go with Diddy right then, but we took the address and got back in the limo. We went back to L'Hermitage, and after we took more ecstasy, Gotti was tearing away at my clothes. Gotti had a strange bedside manner. He would get rough at times, which I could handle when we were high. He also liked to compare himself to other men. He would want to know how they were built and how they had sex. He wanted to know if I liked Diddy and if I was going to sleep with him when I got over there. "You gon' fuck him good, huh?" Gotti asked. I just wanted him to hurry and shut up so I would make my way to Canyon Drive to meet up with Diddy. Gotti sent me on my way and gave me a key to his room so I wouldn't wake him when I returned. It was 4 in the morning when I pulled up to Diddy's home in my SUV. There were security guards in the driveway, all of them dressed in dark suits with their hands clasped in front of them. They stood at attention, waiting for me to approach the gate. They had been expecting me, and they let me in the gate and into the house through the garage. I stood in the hallway, waiting for Diddy. My body was hot as the drugs and alcohol continued to feed off of each other. After just a few minutes, Diddy greeted me and showed me to the nearest bedroom, where Farnsworth Bentley had been sleeping. Diddy woke him and gestured to him to leave the room. My guess was that there was someone else upstairs in Diddy's room and that this was to be my first and final destination within the home. So who is Gotti to you? He asked. And is he cool with this? Gotti's my boy, I said. When I see something I want, he lets me have it. So, with that slight formality out of the way, Diddy and I spent the next 15 minutes or so engaging in the usual. After the experience, he said, "You are one of the best." I said the same to him when, in actuality, he was average. Our sexual encounter was pretty straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary. Before I left, he asked me to meet him back at the house the next morning around 11:30 for brunch. I emphatically accepted and traveled back to L'Hermitage and to Gotti, who was asleep. I crawled into bed and fell asleep beside him. The next morning, Gotti wanted details. I really had nothing to say about my experience with Diddy. He was polite and gentle, and I actually preferred him as a person over Gotti, who was cocky and nasty at times. Gotti seemed a bit frustrated with my unwillingness to give details and even more irritated by the fact that I had been invited back for brunch. He always wanted to present me as his resident whore, but hated it when anyone actually wanted to keep me around, which happened quite often. He almost relished the idea of people using me and then throwing me away, like yesterday's newspaper. But I was beaming from ear to ear as I got dressed and headed back to Diddy's house. Gotti left in a hurry with a look of disgust on his face, and that made me even happier. Back at Diddy's, I was received with open arms by him and his entire staff. I met him upstairs in his dressing quarters where his tailor was fitting him for the upcoming MTV Music Awards. I was awestruck by the vast array of suits, ties, shirts, and shoes. They were so obviously rich in fabric and texture, and he was handsome in everything that he tried on. I stood by the French doors, drinking in the sun, as Farnsworth Bentley sat intently on the floor next to me with his legs crossed, Indian style. He looked up at Diddy with a gleam of admiration. Everyone in the home was devoted to Diddy and catered to all his needs, and, for the afternoon, all of mine. Brunch was served on a long rectangular table in the dining room. Diddy and I sat and talked about who I was and about my relationship with Gotti. He listened but didn't have much to say. He was extremely kind, and I remember him complimenting me, saying I was very pretty and had beautiful skin. I began to understand all the hype about Diddy, why he is this pop culture icon. He's got that star quality, that something which draws people to him and makes them want to be in his space and part of his world. I was no different. By the end of the afternoon, I'd become easily enamored. There was still so much going on during this time in my life. The drug use and drinking got heavier and more frequent. I also began to experiment with different types of ecstasy. The three major components of the drug are cocaine, heroin, and speed. I began to take the drug in large doses and in different mixtures, some with more cocaine or more speed. It would keep me up all night and part of the next day. Under its influence, sex became more of an experience for me, and I would fall even more in love with my mate than I would have done without it. Every night was a party for me, and I easily became less of a person, and even less of a mother. I wouldn't see my son for weeks and even months at a time. My nanny and her family had basically adopted my son. She was the one who potty trained him and got him on solid foods. She and her family were there for him as I ran around the world chasing acceptance and money. Pretty soon, I was burned out. It became increasingly difficult to keep up with the lifestyle I had adopted. Ja would call us all rock stars because that was the type of life we were leading. They had it all: the money, cars, homes, the girls. And if you were with them, you had it all too, until you realized that none of them could ever sustain it. It was all just a myth. I could see we were all growing weary, becoming each day a shadow of the person we'd been before. In fact, we were not rock stars. I was an addict of a more dangerous sort. I became addicted to my companions' lives and to all the material things in them. My body became thin and weary. I wasn't able to sleep or eat because of the drugs and the liquor. Sometime during 2001, I began to reach out for help, even though I was not quite sure what I would do if I got it. On the night before the Soul Train Music Awards, Gotti and I had been up to our regular antics: sex, drugs, alcohol, and hip hop. We had popped a new type of ecstasy. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about 4 times the size of a regular pill. Gotti took a half, and I, being the addict I was, took a whole one. We then drove to the House of Blues on Sunset Boulevard. I don't remember much of that night because the ecstasy had taken over before we even entered the club. What I do remember is lying in bed after the night was over. Gotti was asleep, and I was lying next to him, wide awake, naked, and sweaty from the sex we just had. Emotionally unsettled because of the drugs, I called Little X, the director with whom I worked on Mystical's Danger video. It was 3 in the morning, and I began to talk to him about everything: my childhood, the rape, and my mother. I talked to him about the things I was involved in, including the self abuse. I was sobbing at times and angry at others. Little X listened intently for the next 3 hours and offered what advice he could. He asked the questions that no one had ever really asked, and the answers scared me. "Why do you do this?" he asked. "Do you think these people actually love you? What's happened to you to make you want to live this way?" I saw then how distorted things in my life were, how unsound my judgment had become, and it made my body shake. But I wasn't ready to face the truth, so I ended the phone call with Little X around 6 in the morning, blaming my weakness on the drug. "I have no problems. I'm fine," I told myself before closing my eyes and falling asleep. By April 2001, just 4 months after filming A Man Apart, I was penniless. My drug and alcohol addiction was costing me around $500 a day. My monthly bills at the apartment I barely slept in totaled around $5,000 a month, and there were 3 leased cars in my garage, which cost me upward of about $2,500 each month. I had an SUV, a convertible, and a German sedan. I spent extra money every month in lease payments just to be able to switch cars whenever I decided to go home to pack a new bag. On top of the usual bills, there were also trips and shopping sprees, and even though I was being paid by the men I slept with, I found myself spending all their money and all of mine, too. I had been around the rich and famous for so long, I actually began to believe that I was one of them. Needless to say, I was completely delusional and irresponsible. None of my bills were being paid during the first few months of 2001 as I traveled around the world in a dark cloud. I spent a couple of months in Atlanta and in New York and was a frequent flyer to Miami's South Beach. By the time I finally returned to Los Angeles that April, there was a red letter stuck to my door from the sheriff, and my garage stood empty. All of my cars had been repossessed. My partying and irresponsible ways had finally caught up with me, and I hit what appeared to be rock bottom. After I unlocked my door and walked into my stuffy condo, the first stop was a downstairs bathroom. Sitting on the toilet to urinate, I felt a burning sensation. I screamed from the pain and leaned into the wall for support. I had not been having unprotected sex, but I also knew that the effectiveness of condoms and vaginal films or dental dams were less than 100%. I would find out days later that the alcohol level in my blood was so high that it created the burning sensation. I ignored the pain for the moment as my attention turned to the sheriff's notice. I began to make phone calls to try to salvage what was left of my life. The first person on my list was Shaq. He had been so generous when we were together, and all I needed to keep the condo was $2,000. Stuttering a bit as I explained the situation via telephone, I then heard Shaq turn me down before I even finished my story. "But my son and I will be out on the street in a week if I don't pay them their money," I pleaded. He asked me what happened to all the money I'd made on the movie, and I had to lie. Something about having a sick family member or something. I even cried as I begged for help, but to no avail. I was too ashamed to admit that I had spent all my money by living beyond my means and to support my drug habit. The next call I made was to Irv Gotti, and to my surprise, he too refused me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. As I went down the list, every man I called said no. After about 3 or 4 phone calls, I gave up and brought myself back to the reality of the situation. I had to pack up and move, and do so in a hurry. Within a week, I had put most of everything in storage and had just enough money to rent a car. For the next 9 months, I would be homeless. And sadly, sometimes my son would be living out of my car with me when he wasn't at the home of the family who'd, in large part, taken him in as one of their own. It was as if I were a 16-year-old runaway again, except this time I was responsible for a 3-year-old son. Bouncing from pillar to post, I became more of a hustler than ever. From time to time, I would strip at the famous Crazy Girls Club on Sunset Boulevard. Even worse than that, I resorted to selling my body to men I already knew in the music industry for the money I needed to stay above water. Between keeping a rental car and trying to manage the weekly hotel, I needed at least $1,000 every week, which didn't include essentials such as food and gas. On the weeks I couldn't come up with the cash, my son and I would stay with friends or just sleep in the car. There were a few people who were there for me. I found a warm bed and a hot meal at the homes of directors John Singleton and F. Gary Gray. Whenever they could, they gave me money to help me get on my feet, but it never seemed to be enough. For the moment, I gave up drugs and monitored my alcohol consumption. I was clean and sober, and ironically in need of even more money than before, just to keep up with the increasing costs of renting cars and hotel rooms. It seemed as if I was spending money even more rapidly than I'd done when I'd actually had money. On the nights when there was no money, I would park my car behind the W Hotel in the Westwood section of Los Angeles and rest, or on a quiet back road I found in the heart of the San Fernando Valley. There were days when I drove around all day, not having a place to shower or a restroom to use. I would have to pull over to the side of the road or use a disgusting gas station bathroom. The trunk of the rental car was stacked with the clothes and basic necessities for me and my son. During that winter, we covered ourselves with heavy leather coats in order to keep warm while sleeping in the car. I would wake up to start the car every few hours in order to use the heat, then turn the car off shortly after so as not to waste gas. I would watch my son sleeping on the reclined passenger seat next to me and cry. I knew that I was the one who'd done this to him, and I was determined to fix it. But the path to salvation was still unclear. One thing had become clear to me: the people I considered my friends and even my family were nothing of the sort. Over the past few years, I had done what was asked of me in order to keep the men in my life happy, in hopes that they would always accept me and want me around. I was the life of the party and the ultimate party favor and showpiece, but now I was a person with issues. When I had a problem and was no longer the carefree addict they had all come to know, they didn't want me around. They began to change. The same men who gave me thousands of dollars for shopping sprees and fantasy sexcapades were now donating maybe $200 or $300 to help me in my plight. I was getting less money in my time of need than I was when I was everyone's favorite whore. To get back in the game and back on my feet, I pretended that everything was fine and that all of my problems were temporary. My resources were limited. By the time G left, I was faced with having to deal with thousands of dollars of debt. And now, with the eviction and the repossession of my cars, there was no way I could rent an apartment, no matter how much money I had. What made it even more difficult was not having any family or close friends to depend on for emotional support. I had not been allowed to go back to school while I was with G, and without his financial support, I found it hard to catch my footing. I moved to Los Angeles before obtaining my nurse's aid license. I had office skills and experience working in retail, but no formal education, and working for minimum wage would not satisfy my insurmountable bills. To stay afloat, I had to hustle once again. I would soon turn back to the very men who had used me before and wouldn't help me when I needed help the most. I went back to being hip hop's version of a prostitute, sleeping with men in the industry, both artists and label execs for which I received money. The man I affectionately called Papa was unaware of what was going on in my life. I sheltered him from the truth out of shame, but he must have known I was headed for trouble. Throughout our time together, he frequently told me that I would have to change my life completely in order to be happy. He was always there for me financially, but I would never ask for more than he offered. We saw each other whenever he was in Los Angeles, and we met in other places, such as New York and Miami. In October of 2001, Papa and I ended up spending a few days together in Los Angeles. Now back in the game, I was back to my old party girl ways. I had been holed up at the luxurious St. Regis Hotel in Century City with Eva, a girlfriend of mine and the longtime girlfriend of Ja. She and I had become extremely close as friends and lovers after a menage a trois with Ja in May 2001. We took baths together, popped ecstasy, and lounged around in bed enjoying the high. When the phone rang on that day, Eva answered, then handed it to me. It was Papa. I'd left him a message earlier letting him know where I was and that I wanted to see him. I left the St. Regis and drove to the hotel where he was staying that night. Once there, we made love, and the emotions of the moment made me weep with satisfaction. Papa had always been more than my lover. He was easily my best friend and the one person who I knew loved me. Although he had recently married at the time, I couldn't stop being in love with him. I should have been angry and disappointed enough to walk away from him, but he was already in my head and become very much a part of my life. I spent the next morning with him in the studio as he worked into the early evening. Right before he was to head back to the hotel, I rushed to get there before he arrived. I got a key to his room from the front desk, drew myself a bath, lit candles around it, and sat in it while eating from a bowl of grapes. I was going to surprise him, so I called Papa on his cell to ask where he was. At the very moment he was explaining to me that he was still working, I heard him come through the hotel room door. Once he realized that I was actually waiting for him in the tub, he became enraged. He yelled at me about him being married. What if I had my wife with me? He said I had no right to sneak back into his hotel room and wait for him without notice or permission. He crushed me with every word. I was dying inside and couldn't take the pain. I got dressed and ran out of the hotel in tears. Unfortunately, I headed back to the people who were always there for me, despite what came with the lifestyle. I headed back to Murder Inc. The night began rather typically, nothing out of the ordinary. I called Eva and agreed to meet her with a few members of Murder Inc. at Mr. Chow. Depressed and confused, I sat at the table brooding over the fight I'd had with Papa. He was my backbone in my most trying times, and now he too seemed to be against me. I need something, I said to one of Ja's people. Give me a pill. He flipped open the inseam of his jacket and pulled a pill from behind one of the buttons. He handed it to me, and without looking, I placed it on my tongue and chased it down with a shot of sake. I sat at the table with my head in my hands for what seemed to be about 3 minutes, when all of a sudden things seemed to go very wrong. I began to feel numb and hot all over. The noise from the restaurant began to overpower me and seemed deafening. I turned to Eva and asked her to follow me to the upstairs bathroom. Once in the restroom, I sat on the toilet with my head on my knees. Slowly, I could see the shaking begin from my feet and travel all the way up my body until I could no longer control it. From that point, I blacked out as my body went into a seizure. My next memory is of waking up on the bathroom floor. Eva was nowhere in sight. I was alone, right back where I started. I slowly stood up and held on to the sink, looking at myself in the mirror. My pupils were dilated, and I could feel my wobbly knees giving out underneath me. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to snap out of the trouble I was in. Soon, I was on the floor again, waking up from another bout of convulsions. My tongue was swollen and bloody. I made my way back to the sink and splashed more water on my face. I opened the bathroom door and began to scream my son's name into the stairwell that led to the restaurant. My heart was racing, accompanied by a dry mouth and blurred vision. No one was there for me. I felt I would die alone. Finally, a woman came in to use the restroom. She took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I told her I was an epileptic and had been having seizures. Within seconds, the manager of the restaurant was at my side, laying me down on the tile floor and propping my feet up. Only then did Eva return with a couple of members of the Inc. After just a few minutes, I began to feel a bit more level headed. My first thought should have been for my health, but in fact, it was about how this would affect the reputations of the members of Murder Inc. and the unwanted attention it would bring them and the other celebrities in the restaurant, some of whom I knew. I could hear the ambulance making its way up the street, and before it arrived, Eva and I sneaked out of Mr. Chow and went back to the St. Regis Hotel. I cried all the way there while being held by Remy, a Def Jam employee. I cried for Papa, begging Remy to call him and tell him what had happened to me. He didn't come. Once I was in the hotel, everyone decided to go to a club, and I was left to deal with the aftermath of my seizures. My head was pounding, my tongue was swollen, and my speech was slurred. I began to call everyone I could. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and I can't remember everyone I called, but I remember calling my dad. His words broke my heart and shut me out further than I had been already. I told him about the drugs and the seizures and that I needed help. He responded, "It's late. Call me tomorrow or something." He had never really been there when I was growing up. And although he was there to save me from my mother, he had always told his children that they could never come home again once they left, no matter what. If anyone could have saved me, he could have. I felt as if he bothered with me only when it appeared I was doing well, while I was living the high life with G. But now that I was down and out, he was too tired to even acknowledge my desperate voice. I had known I was alone before, but that night it was made painfully clear just how alone I was. I cried all night until finally I fell asleep. Chapter 14. Miami Advice. After suffering from the drug-induced seizures, I spent the next few days in bed at a friend's house. For about 3 days I was high and my speech remained slurred and incomprehensible. I began to reach out to the people who I believed could help me. I wanted to talk to someone who would take the time and care enough to help me get better. Everyone I called, however, seemed to be too busy to talk. Everyone had their own lives, and it looked as if I would have to fend for myself. I wasn't allowed to stay where I was for too long and found myself back on the streets again, with my son. By this time, Papa had sent me enough money to buy a car, so I would no longer have to rent one. Once again, I found myself sleeping in my car and at the homes of various acquaintances throughout Los Angeles. In a strange twist of fate, I found help in basketball icon and businessman Magic Johnson. We were introduced by a woman I met who was personal assistant to Lorenz Tate during the filming of Man Apart. She also happened to be the sister of the Def Jam executive who allowed me to sleep at Def Jam offices after closing time. After I explained my story to her, she felt compelled to tell Magic, who was then her boss, about me and my son. He met with us immediately and saw to it that my son and I slept in a hotel that night. Over the next few months, Magic, his friends, and staff would be my greatest supporters. Throughout November and December of 2001, he saw to it that my son and I were comfortable, safe, and able to celebrate the holidays. Magic paid for us to stay at the extended stay hotel in Woodland Hills and made sure that there was a Christmas tree with presents under it for my son. Sometimes he arranged for a sitter in order for me to enjoy concerts and parties. Magic allowed me the luxury of relaxation at times, for which I will always be grateful. Yet he was not willing to help me change my life. In fact, I came to realize that a life change for the better was no one's responsibility but my own. I had been through so much over the past 8 months of sleeping wherever I could that when Exhibit called me a few days before Christmas to invite me to Miami for New Year's, I was ecstatic. Exhibit and I had met on December 27th, 2000, the same day I was first introduced to Dr. Dre at the filming of the Forgot About Dre video. During those 2 years, Exhibit and I shared an off and on intimate relationship. I found him funny and smart, and he had always seemed to be extremely grounded, more so than the others. I considered him a friend because he was one of the few people in my life who never treated me any differently, despite what he may have heard about me. Our relationship had been kept private, and only those closest to him knew of our connection. Like many, if not all the men in my life, I loved Exhibit and enjoyed every moment we spent together. We arrived in Miami on December 29th. When most of the country was freezing, Miami was a balmy 80 degrees. We checked into the Turnberry Resort about a half hour from Miami Beach. Our suite overlooked the golf course and a lake filled with white swans. We were to stay there for the next 2 weeks at the expense of Loud Records, Exhibit's label. We checked into our luxurious suite and began what would be the vacation of a lifetime for me, for more reasons than just relaxation and fun. We dined at the most elite restaurants, enjoying the finest foods, wines, and desserts. We took trips to the malls and made late night runs to the beach for pressed Cuban sandwiches. We were in paradise, but there was one reason in particular for the trip, and that was to attend Diddy's pre New Year's Eve party at his home and his New Year's Eve bash at the Shore Club. Diddy had no idea that I would be coming, and I hadn't seen him since earlier that year. I had not told Exhibit that Diddy and I knew each other for fear he would decide not to take me. I was looking forward to seeing Diddy again, and especially to what I knew would be the look on his face when he saw me. Finally, the moment arrived, and Exhibit and I stepped into Diddy's home. I looked around for a moment and saw a lot of people who I knew, yet I was only concerned with the host. Just as I was scanning the room for him, Diddy appeared in front of us. All of his attention was on Exhibit as he greeted him, thanking him for coming. As he moved down the line, his eyes fixed on my face and his jaw dropped. Diddy said his hellos and gave me a generous hug, then grabbed me by the hand and pulled me out to the front lawn. Diddy asked uneasily, "We're cool, right? I mean, we're friends, right?" I was confused by the line of questioning, but assured him we were, in fact, cool. He continued, "I'm saying though, you know I have kids and a mother and people who love me. I can't afford for anything to get out. I don't want them to be upset." I was still very confused, but reassured him that I would in no way try to harm him, and especially not his family and loved ones. We went back into the house and met back up with Exhibit. The look on Exhibit's face was asking, "What's going on?" And all I could do was shrug my shoulders. I had no idea. I went along to mingle with the rest of the attendees and say hello to the people I knew. Diddy and Exhibit disappeared upstairs at Diddy's request, leaving me baffled. About 45 minutes later, Exhibit came downstairs and grabbed me by my forearm, dragging me out to the front lawn. His eyes were wide and his mouth open. "What did you do to that man?" he asked. I was even more confused than ever. Exhibit went on to describe the conversation he'd had with Diddy. Diddy had warned Exhibit to be careful around me and to not let me near his home. Diddy even confided that he was in the process of buying the home we were in, but now that I had been there, he would not go through with the purchase. Then he said something even stranger. Exhibit told me that Diddy said, "She'll have you on video with fingers in your booty." By this point, Exhibit was just as confused as me. We stood on the front lawn laughing hysterically. Diddy appeared to be under the influence. But underneath the laughter, there was a serious thought running through my head. Why was Diddy this anxious around me? I remained baffled and threw the thought into the back of my mind as Exhibit and I rejoined the party. There was fabulous food and drink and plenty of other stimulation. We were all having such a good time, with maybe the exception of Farnsworth, who appeared to have gotten on Diddy's bad side that evening. We partied until the early morning and were expecting it all to come to an end when Diddy summoned Exhibit and me to join him in heading to a local nightclub. The three of us jumped into his black on black SUV, which was a small part of his large convoy of similar vehicles. After a short ride, we arrived at the nightclub. I don't remember the name of the club, but I do remember what it was like inside. At first, we all sat in the VIP area and cracked open a few bottles of champagne and made a toast to the new year. It felt good to be out with Exhibit and even with Diddy. We were all happy and living in the moment. All of the troubles which awaited me back in Los Angeles were just that, back in Los Angeles. The club was full of energy, the music was loud, and the dance floor was packed. There were several men who were shirtless, and the few women who were there were also wearing very little. Exhibit went crazy when we got on the dance floor. Not one for dancing, I stood on the sidelines and watched him. He was so happy, so free, and enjoying his blessed life. I couldn't help but feel a little sad as the alcohol began to wear off. I wanted this moment to last forever. The laughing, the sips of premium champagne, the loud music, and carefree feelings.